Story 1. Route 666, the house where they vanished. I still don't know why I drove out to that house. Sometimes I think I was drawn there, like something knew I was coming. It was October when I first heard about it. A creepy story passed around at work, mentioned in passing by a guy named Marcus who grew up in rural Pennsylvania. He said his grandfather had seen something. Seen what, exactly? A haunted house, a terrifying place, a mystery that was never solved. The kind of thing that makes you wonder if you be brave enough to find the truth, or if ignorance would have been better. That's what got me. That uncertainty, that gnawing feeling that something wrong happened out there, and nobody ever explained it. The story went like this. In 1993, a family of 4 vanished from a farmhouse on Route 666, about 40 miles northeast of Scranton. The Hendersons, parents in their 40s, 2 kids, gone overnight. The scary part wasn't the absence. It was what they left behind. When state police arrived the next morning, responding to a welfare check from the family, this employer, they found the front door locked from the inside. All the doors were locked from the inside. Windows sealed shut. In the kitchen, dinner was still sitting on the table. Turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes. The food was cold but not moldy, not decomposed, like it had been left there only hours before. But the family had disappeared days ago. Or weeks. Time had stopped in that house in a way that didn't make sense. The television was still on, tuned to static. Not a news broadcast, not a commercial, pure, dead static. The officers who responded said the sound of it haunted their dreams for months. That endless white noise, that eerie, unsettling static, like the house itself was screaming. But they found no bodies, no blood, no signs of struggle. It was as if the Hendersons simply ceased to exist, vanished from reality itself. The case went cold within a year. No leads, no witnesses. The farmhouse sat empty for decades, waiting, watching. Growing darker with each passing season. Marcus told me the place was still standing. The house was still there on Route 666, untouched, as if sealed in time like that frozen dinner table. He said kids used to dare each other to go inside. Some came back out, others didn't. Or so the legend claimed. He didn't know if any of it was true. He just knew the house existed, and he knew it was terrifying. That was enough for me. I am not the kind of person who seeks out scary places. I am 38 years old, a systems analyst, divorced, living alone in Pittsburgh. I've never been drawn to paranormal nonsense. I don't believe in ghosts. But I do believe in mysteries. I believe in the unknown. I believe that sometimes there are questions in this world that demand answers, even if finding those answers means stepping into the darkness. It took me 6 weeks to track down the exact location. Route 666 was real, though the number has since been changed on most official maps. Old Pennsylvania highways have their secrets. The locals know them by their forgotten names. I called Marcus 3 times before he reluctantly gave me directions. He didn't want me to go. He said it was a bad idea. He said some things are better left buried. I drove out on a Friday night in November. The weather was turning bitter. Snow was predicted, the kind of night where the world feels smaller, colder, more vulnerable. The kind of night when terrifying things seem possible. Route 666 was nothing like I expected. It wasn't some ominous mountain pass or twisted forest road. It was flat and ordinary and rural. Open fields stretched endlessly on both sides, broken only by dilapidated barns and abandoned farmhouses. This was Pennsylvania, its forgotten country, where the economy had collapsed decades ago and nobody bothered to rebuild. Where time moved differently, where people went missing and nobody thought to ask why. The Henderson house appeared suddenly around a bend. I almost drove past it. It was smaller than I imagined. A simple 2-story farmhouse with a wraparound porch. Yellow paint, faded and peeling. A black mailbox hung crooked at the end of the driveway. The place looked older than 1993. It looked like it had been waiting there since before the Henderson family ever moved in, holding space for something terrifying to happen. I parked about 100 yards away. I don't know why. Something told me not to drive all the way up. Some instinct that hadn't been shaken loose by reason and skepticism. I grabbed a flashlight from my trunk, though the moon was bright enough to see by. The night was clear and cold and deeply unsettling. I could see my breath in the air. My hands were shaking, and I told myself it was the cold. Walking toward the house, I noticed something wrong about the property. The ground felt different, harder, like the earth itself had solidified, become something unnatural. The grass wasn't growing here. It was dead, sparse, black in places. No lights on inside, no sign of habitation, just the terrifying emptiness of a place where people had vanished. The front porch was covered in leaves, years of leaves. They crunched under my boots, and the sound seemed to carry forever across the quiet fields. The mailbox near the road had my name on it. Not resident, not occupant. My name, David Mitchell. The name that hadn't been there minutes before when I'd driven past. I know what I saw. I know, I'm not crazy. The mailbox changed. The front door was locked, just like the police report said. Just like it had been that morning in 1993 when the officers arrived to find a family erased. I pressed my face against the living room window and pointed my flashlight inside. My breath fogged the glass. Behind the fog, I could see the interior of the house. It was wrong. The furniture was arranged perfectly, like a museum display. A sofa facing a television, a coffee table with magazines. Everything was neat, organized, and utterly devoid of life. There was dust everywhere, thick and undisturbed, and yet the room felt charged with something. Something watching, something waiting. The television set on top of the entertainment center was turned toward the window as if waiting for me to arrive. As if it had always been waiting. I moved to the side of the house. There was a basement window, low and dark. I crouched down and shined my light through the glass. The basement was flooded. Water, black and still and reflecting nothing, covered the floor. But I hadn't seen any water damage on the outside of the house. No moisture seeping from the foundation. No ice. No explanation for how that much water could be contained without overflowing. The water was perfectly level, like it existed in its own space, separate from the laws of physics. That is when I heard the sound. It came from inside the house. A low humming. Not mechanical. Not anything I could identify. It was the same sound Marcus had described. The sound of that television playing static. But there was something else underneath it. Something almost like breathing. Like the house itself was alive and inhaling. Slowly, deeply. Waiting for something. I stood up and backed away from the window. My heart was hammering against my ribs. This was real. The creepy feeling I had come to find. The unsettling atmosphere. The sense of something terrifying lurking just beyond perception. It was all real, but I wasn't ready to leave. Not yet. I needed to understand. I walked around to the back of the house. There was a kitchen door, also locked. Through the window, I could see the dining room table. It was set for 4. Plates, silverware, napkins folded precisely. And on those plates, there was food. Turkey, stuffing, sweet potatoes. The same meal described in the police report. The same meal, after 30 years. The food was not rotted. It was not covered in mold. It looked fresh. It looked like it had been prepared that afternoon. Steam rose from it in thin wisps. And I realized with a chilling, unsettling shock that the food was still warm. Still hot. As if someone had just walked away from dinner moments ago. As if time inside that house had never moved forward. As if the Hendersons were still there. Still eating. Still trapped in that final meal. I tried the door handle. It turned easily in my grip. I don't remember opening the door. I don't remember stepping inside. But suddenly I was in the kitchen of the Henderson house. And the smell of the meal filled my nostrils. Turkey and herbs and something else. Something dark and wrong and deeply disturbing that I couldn't identify. The air was colder inside than it had been outside. So cold my breath came in white clouds. So cold it felt like I was stepping into a freezer. The table was directly to my left. I turned my head to look at it, and I saw them. The Henderson family sat in their chairs, one at each side of the table. They were not decomposed. They were not skeletons. They were complete, intact, their skin pale and waxy but preserved perfectly. Their eyes were open, staring down at their plates. Their hands rested on the table. They wore the clothes from the missing person reports. The father in a button-up shirt. The mother in a sweater. The children in school clothes. They were not moving, but they were not dead. I could feel the difference. They were in a state that was neither living nor dead. A suspended animation. A pause in time that held them in a nightmare state between existence and non-existence. The terrifying realization settled over me like a cold blanket. And then the mother's head moved. It turned slowly, so slowly that at first I thought I imagined it. But no, her head rotated on her neck with a sound like creaking wood. And her eyes, those pale, dead eyes, looked directly at me. Her mouth opened. The static sound from upstairs grew louder, deafening. The humming I heard from outside the house rose to a crescendo, and it filled my ears with a sound like dying, like drowning, like the world ending in white noise. I ran. I don't remember leaving the house. I don't remember running through the fields, but I found myself in my car, hands trembling so badly I could barely grip the steering wheel. My headlights illuminated the farmhouse behind me, and I saw movement in every window. Shadows, figures, things that shouldn't have been there, things that had been waiting in that house since 1993, things that the Henderson family had become, things that would become like them if they stayed long enough. I drove for an hour before I stopped. I pulled into a 24-hour gas station and sat in my car in the parking lot, trying to convince myself that what I'd seen was a hallucination. Low blood sugar, stress, my mind playing tricks on me because I hyped myself up with scary stories. But then I realized something that made my blood run cold. The digital clock on my car's dashboard said 7:47 p.m. I arrived at the house at 8:15 p.m. I'd been there for hours, at least 3 or 4 hours. And yet, I had no memory of that time. It had vanished, erased, like I stepped outside of reality for a period that my mind couldn't process. I called Marcus from the gas station phone. He didn't answer. I called him again, and again. Finally, at 3 a.m, he picked up. His voice was strange, distorted, like he was very far away. He told me he'd been expecting my call. He told me he'd always known I would go to the house. He said his grandfather had just seen something at that farmhouse. His grandfather had gone inside, had sat at that table, had eaten that meal, had become part of what waited there. Marcus said he'd been born the day after his grandfather vanished. That sometimes he could feel his grandfather inside his thoughts, watching, waiting, hoping that one day someone would come and take his place so he could finally leave. The line went dead. I haven't been home since that night. I've been driving across America for 6 months now, moving constantly, never staying in one place long enough to feel anchored. Because I understand now, I understand what that house does. It traps you outside of time. It feeds on people. It holds them in a moment of the most profound terror and feeds on their fear like it was sustenance. And it's still hungry. It will always be hungry. Sometimes, late at night, I hear the static. That endless, unsettling white noise. I hear it through the walls of my motel room. I hear it in the hum of the highway. I hear it in the spaces between my thoughts. And I know that it's calling me back. That house on Route 666 is calling me back. The Hendersons are calling me back. My time away from that place is temporary. They be patient. They can wait, because I felt them even as I was running. I felt them attaching themselves to me. Just a little bit, just enough to keep me connected. Just enough to make sure that one day, when I'm tired of running, when I can to move anymore, I'll find myself walking back up that driveway. I'll step inside that kitchen. I'll sit at that table. And I'll join them in that terrible, timeless meal. The most terrifying part of all of this, the thing that truly haunts me, is that I'm not even sure I'm resisting anymore. Every night, I dream about that table, about those plates of turkey and stuffing, about how warm the food was, about how comfortable that chair seemed. I dream about looking down at my own plate, and in those dreams, the meal tastes like hope and peace and an end to all this running. I know what is going to happen. I know that eventually my resistance will break down. I'll get too tired. I'll get too scared. And I'll drive back to Route 666 in the dark, knowing exactly what I'll find there. And I won't fight it anymore. I'll sit down at that table with the Henderson family. And I'll finally understand why they still smiling, even though they suspended in their moment of most profound fear. The house is still there, waiting in the darkness. And now you know about it. Now you know about Route 666 and the family that vanished. Now the house knows that you know. And that means it is watching you too. That means it is hungry for you as well. Some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. Some houses, once acknowledged, become impossible to ignore. The Henderson house is one of them. And now we're all connected to it. All of us who heard this story. All of us who understand what is real and what is waiting in the spaces between reality. The static never really stops, does it? Even now, as you listen, you can almost hear it. That endless, creepy hum underneath everything. That haunting sound that means something is watching, something is waiting, something is hungry, and it knows your name. Story 2. Coal town that never slept. I should have known something was wrong the moment I saw the smoke. Not the thick black kind that pours from a factory or a house fire. This was different. Thin, almost transparent, rising from cracks in the asphalt like the earth itself was exhaling. The smell hit me next. Sharp and chemical, burning the inside of my nose. Sulfur mixed with something else, something rotten that I couldn't quite place. This was Centralia, Pennsylvania, a town that had been burning underground for over 60 years. And I had just made the biggest mistake of my life by stopping here. The GPS had died 20 miles back, somewhere along Route 61, and my phone had no signal. The highway stretched empty in both directions, surrounded by dense Pennsylvania forest that seemed to swallow the afternoon light. I needed directions, maybe some gas, and the faded sign promising food and lodging had seemed like a blessing. Now, standing in what passed for the town center, I realized how disturbing this place truly was. The buildings stood like broken teeth, windows boarded up, walls covered in graffiti that ranged from crude tags to eerie warnings. The fire never stops. Someone had spray painted across an old post office. They still down there, marked the side of what looked like an abandoned general store. But it was the silence that got to me first. No birds, no insects, no wind moving through the trees. Just that constant, almost imperceptible hissing sound, like the world was slowly deflating. I walked past a collapsed church, its steeple lying in the overgrown grass like a fallen giant. The ground beneath my feet felt warm, unnaturally so for October. Heat radiated up through the soles of my boots, and I could see more of those thin smoke wisps rising from fissures that split the street in jagged patterns. The pavement buckled and warped, creating valleys and hills where flat roads should have been. This was what happened when an entire coal seam caught fire beneath a town, when the earth became a crematorium that would burn for centuries. I had read about Centralia before, back when I was planning this cross-country drive. A mining accident in 1962, they said, or maybe an intentional burn in the town dump that got out of control. Either way, the fire spread through the maze of coal mines beneath the town, making the ground unstable, filling basements with toxic gas, turning the whole place into a slow-motion disaster. The government had relocated most of the residents by the 90s. The town was officially condemned. Only a handful of stubborn holdouts remained, refusing to leave their homes even as the earth tried to swallow them. But as I stood there in the terrifying quiet, I didn't see any holdouts. No cars, no lights in windows, no signs of life at all. That should have been my cue to leave. Get back in the car, turn around, find another route. But then I heard it. Footsteps, clear and distinct, echoing off the empty buildings. Someone walking with purpose, boots striking pavement in a steady rhythm. The sound came from somewhere ahead, deeper into town, past a row of houses that leaned at disturbing angles. Relief flooded through me. Someone was here, someone who could help me get my bearings, point me back toward civilization. I called out, my voice sounding strange and flat in the dead air. No response, just those footsteps, continuing their steady pace, never getting closer or farther away. I followed them. The houses grew more decrepit as I walked. Some had partially collapsed. Their roofs caved in, their walls bulging outward like they were being pushed from inside. Others looked almost intact, curtains still hanging in the windows, mailboxes standing upright by the curb. But the heat increased with every step, and the smoke grew thicker. I passed a playground where the metal swings had melted and fused together, forming nightmare shapes in the afternoon shadows. The footsteps stopped. I froze, listening. Nothing. Then, from somewhere to my left, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. Voices, multiple voices, all talking at once, their words overlapping and incomprehensible. They seemed to come from inside one of the houses, a two-story colonial with faded blue paint and a condemned sign nailed to the front door. Light flickered in the upstairs windows, warm and inviting, completely at odds with the horror of everything else around me. Every instinct screamed at me to run, but curiosity, that creepy, unsettling pull toward the unknown that gets people killed in situations like this, drew me forward. I climbed the porch steps, each board groaning under my weight. The door stood slightly ajar, and that is when I noticed something chilling. The voices weren't speaking English. They weren't speaking any language I recognized. The sounds were rhythmic, almost mechanical, like some kind of coded transmission or prayer repeated endlessly. I pushed the door open. The inside of the house looked lived in. A coat rack held jackets. Shoes lined up neatly by the door. Family photos covered the walls, black and white images of smiling people from decades past. The furniture looked old but cared for, and the air smelled of something cooking, something that made my stomach turn. That rotten smell from outside had intensified, mixing with the chemical stench of the underground fire. The voices came from upstairs. I should have left. God, I should have run straight back to my car. Instead, I climbed the stairs, my hand gripping the railing, my heart hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. The steps creaked beneath me, announcing my presence, but the voices never stopped their disturbing chant. At the top of the stairs, I found a hallway with 3 doors. One stood open, revealing a bedroom. The light I had seen from outside came from dozens of candles arranged around the room, their flames dancing in a non-existent breeze. And in the center of the room, I saw what was making those sounds. Nothing. The room was empty. No people, no speakers, no logical source for the voices that continued their eerie chorus all around me. But as I stood in the doorway, frozen with fear, I noticed something horrifying on the floor. Footprints, fresh footprints in a thick layer of dust, leading from the door to the window and back again, over and over, wearing a path in the grime. And they were still forming. As I watched, a new print appeared, then another, as if invisible feet were pacing the room. The temperature dropped suddenly, dramatically, going from uncomfortably warm to freezing in seconds. My breath came out in visible clouds. The candles flickered wildly, their flames stretching toward the ceiling in defiance of physics. And then I heard it, a sound that will haunt me until the day I die. A whisper, right next to my ear, so close I felt breath on my skin. We still down there? I ran. I don't remember getting down the stairs or out the door. I just remember running, my lungs burning, my legs pumping, terror giving me speed I didn't know I possessed. The footsteps followed me, not just one set now, but dozens, hundreds, an army of invisible people matching my pace, surrounding me, herding me deeper into the nightmare town. The street ahead of me began to crack, not the small fissures I had seen before, but massive splits in the earth, opening like hungry mouths. Smoke poured out, thick and black now, filling the air with choking darkness. The heat became unbearable, like standing next to an open furnace. And through the smoke, I saw them. Lights, dozens of lights moving beneath the cracked pavement, shining up through the gaps like eyes staring from underground. They moved with purpose, following paths that must have once been mine tunnels, now transformed into something else entirely. The lights grew brighter, and I realized with chilling certainty that they were rising, coming up from the depths, bringing whatever horror had been trapped down there for decades. A hand grabbed my shoulder. I screamed and spun around, but there was nothing there, just empty air. Yet I felt it, solid and real, fingers digging into my flesh with terrifying strength. More hands grabbed me, invisible hands pulling at my clothes, my hair, my arms. I thrashed and fought. But how do you fight something you can, TC? The voices surrounded me now, no longer distant and incomprehensible, but clear and urgent. Join us. Stay with us. They've been waiting. The fire never stops. Never stops. Never stops. The chant grew louder, more frantic, and I felt myself being dragged toward one of the larger cracks in the earth. The heat radiating from it was beyond anything I had experienced. I could see flames now, real flames licking up from the depths, and silhouettes. Dark shapes moving in the fire, human-shaped but wrong, too tall and thin, their movements jerky and unnatural. With strength born from pure terror, I broke free. The invisible hands released me all at once, and I stumbled backward, falling hard on the superheated pavement. Pain shot through my palms where they hit the ground, the skin blistering instantly. But I scrambled to my feet and ran toward where I thought I had left my car. The town shifted around me. Streets I had walked minutes ago now led in different directions. Buildings appeared and disappeared in the smoke. I was lost in a maze that changed with each terrifying moment, hunted by things that had once been human but had been transformed by decades in the burning dark beneath Pennsylvania. Then I saw it, my car, sitting exactly where I had left it, untouched and real in a sea of horror. I sprinted toward it, fumbled with my keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit the key in the lock. The voices screamed behind me, a sound of rage and hunger and desperate longing. I threw myself into the driver's seat, slammed the door, started the engine. The car wouldn't move. I looked down and saw hands, hundreds of them, emerging from the smoke and grasping the vehicle. They covered the hood, the doors, the windows, pressing against the glass, leaving prints that glowed red hot. Faces appeared in the smoke, translucent and agonized, mouths open in silent screams. And I understood. These were the miners, the ones who had died in the fire or had been trapped when the tunnels collapsed. They had never left. They couldn't leave. The fire had claimed them, and now they haunted this burning town, searching for company in their eternal nightmare. I floored the accelerator. The tires spun, smoke pouring from the rubber, the smell of burning filling the car. The hands pulled harder, and for a horrifying moment, I thought they would succeed in keeping me there forever. Then, with a sound like tearing fabric, the car lurched forward. The hands fell away, their grip broken, and I rocketed down the street, not caring where I was going as long as it was away. I drove for what felt like hours but was probably only minutes. The town seemed to stretch on forever, an impossible maze of cracked streets and burning ground. But finally, mercifully, I saw the highway ahead, real and solid and normal. I burst onto it, nearly rolling the car as I took the turn too fast, and kept driving. I drove until Centralia was miles behind me, until I found a rest stop with actual people and working phones. I never reported what happened. Who would believe me? I barely believe it myself. But sometimes, late at night, I hear footsteps outside my window. I smell sulfur. I feel hands on my shoulder that are in there, and I know, with chilling certainty, that some part of Centralia followed me home. The town still burns. The fire will burn for another 200 years, maybe more. And in that darkness, in those endless tunnels of heat and smoke and terror, something waits. Something that was human once but isn't anymore. Something that remembers what it lost and desperately, horrifyingly, wants it back. I tell myself I imagined it. Heat stroke, stress, a mind playing tricks in a creepy environment. But I know the truth. I know what I felt, what I heard, what I saw. The coal town never sleeps because the dead never rest. They pace, they call, they wait for the next lost traveler to stumble into their nightmare. And somewhere in Pennsylvania, smoke still rises from the ground. Story 3. Burning ground. I should have never stopped in Centralia, Pennsylvania. But when your car starts overheating on a desolate highway at 2 in the morning, you don't have many choices. What I didn't know was that some towns should stay forgotten, and some fires should never be disturbed. The steam rising from the cracked asphalt looked like smoke at first. That should have been my warning. Everyone knows about Centralia, the town that has been burning underground since 1962, where the coal mines caught fire and never stopped. Most people think it is abandoned. They were wrong. Someone is still there, waiting in the darkness between the flames. My engine light had been flashing for miles, the temperature gauge climbing into the red zone. The GPS showed nothing but empty road for another 40 miles, so when I saw the exit sign for Centralia, I took it without thinking. The sign was rusted, covered in graffiti, and riddled with bullet holes. Underneath, someone had spray painted, "Turn back." I wish I had listened. The road into town was worse than I expected. Massive cracks split the pavement, some wide enough to swallow a tire. Heat radiated up from below, and I could smell sulfur thick in the air. My headlights caught abandoned houses, their windows dark and watching. Graffiti covered everything. Warnings, names, dates. But one message appeared over and over, painted in dripping red letters. She is still down there. I found what looked like an old gas station, though the pumps were long dead and covered in rust. I pulled over, letting my engine cool, trying to figure out my next move. That is when I noticed the girl standing at the edge of my headlights. She looked about 16, wearing a faded yellow dress that seemed decades out of style. Her dark hair hung long and tangled around her face. She wasn't moving, just staring at my car with an expression I couldn't read. Something about her felt wrong, disturbing in a way I couldn't explain. The air around her seemed to shimmer with heat. I grabbed my phone to call for help, but there was no signal. Of course there was an T. I looked up again, and she was gone. Just empty road and creeping shadows where she had been standing. My heart hammered against my ribs. The rational part of my brain said I imagined her, that the stress and exhaustion were playing tricks on me. But I knew what I'd seen. The temperature gauge had dropped back to normal, so I started the engine again. I needed to get out of Centralia before something worse happened. But as I shifted into drive, I saw her again in my rearview mirror. She was standing directly behind my car now, closer than before. Her mouth was open like she was screaming, but no sound came out. I hit the gas. The car lurched forward, and I didn't look back until I'd driven several blocks. When I finally checked the mirror again, the road behind me was empty. But ahead, smoke was rising from a crack in the pavement, and the road I'd just driven down was completely blocked. Somehow, between one moment and the next, a section of the street had collapsed entirely, leaving a smoking pit where asphalt used to be. I was trapped. The girl appeared again, this time standing in the middle of the road ahead. She raised one pale arm and pointed toward a side street. I had no other option. Every other route was blocked by collapsed roads or barriers. I turned where she pointed, following the only path that remained open. She led me deeper into the dead town. Houses crowded together on both sides, their doors hanging open, their roofs caving in. Every surface was covered in that same graffiti, dates from the 1960s, warnings about fire and smoke, and always that same horrifying message. She's still down there. Some walls had old missing person flyers, faded and torn, showing the faces of people who had disappeared decades ago. One face appeared more than others, a teenage girl with dark hair and a yellow dress. The flyer said her name was Sarah Brennan. She vanished in 1961, just months before the mine fire started. The girl in the yellow dress kept appearing and disappearing, always just ahead, always pointing the way forward. Each time I saw her, she looked more desperate, more terrifying. Her skin was too pale, her eyes too dark. Heat waves distorted the air around her like she was standing too close to flames. My car rolled past the old church, its steeple collapsed and its graveyard overgrown with dead grass. Past the abandoned school where broken swings creaked in the hot wind. Past houses where I could swear I saw shadows moving behind shattered windows. The whole town felt alive with unseen presence, with something old and angry burning underneath. Then she led me to the center of town, where the ground had split open into a massive sinkhole. Steam and smoke poured out of it, carrying that overwhelming sulfur smell that made my eyes water. My headlights illuminated the edge of the pit, and I slammed on the brakes just in time. Another few feet and I would have driven straight in. The girl stood at the very edge of the pit, her yellow dress fluttering in the heat rising from below. She was looking down into the darkness, and for the first time, I could see her face clearly. It was Sarah Brennan from the missing person flyers, but her skin was cracked and blackened like charred wood, and her eyes glowed with reflected firelight from somewhere deep below. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. Horror flooded through me as I realized what I was seeing. This wasn't a ghost. This was something else, something that had been burning underground for over 60 years, something that had taken Sarah Brennan and never let her go. She turned to look at me, and her mouth opened in that silent scream again. This time, I understood. She wasn't trying to scare me. She was trying to warn me, because something else was down there in the burning darkness beneath Centralia. Something that had kept her trapped, and now it knew I was here too. The ground beneath my car started to crack. Small fissures appeared in the asphalt, spreading like spiderwebs, glowing orange from below. Heat seeped up through the floorboards, making the interior unbearably hot. My hands burned against the steering wheel. The engine started making a terrible grinding noise, and the smell of melting rubber filled the air. I threw the car in reverse, but the wheels just spun uselessly. The asphalt had gone soft beneath me, turning into something like tar. I was sinking. The cracks widened, and through them I could see fire, actual flames dancing underneath the street, and something moving down there. Something large and dark that shifted through the burning coal with terrible purpose. Sarah, as Ghost pointed frantically behind me, her silent screams becoming more desperate. I abandoned the car, throwing the door open and stumbling onto pavement that burned through my shoes. The air was thick with smoke now, making it hard to see or breathe. Behind me, My car groaned and tilted as the ground gave way beneath it. With a horrible crashing sound, it disappeared into the pit, swallowed by fire and darkness. I ran, Sarah's ghost appeared ahead of me, leading me through the maze of ruined streets. Each time I thought I'd found a way out, the road would collapse or burst into flames, forcing me to change direction. It felt like the town itself was alive, like something underneath was hurting me, playing with me, enjoying my fear and panic. My lungs burned from breathing the sulfur-filled air. My feet were blistered and raw, but I kept running, following the girl in the yellow dress as she led me through nightmare streets where the ground cracked and glowed beneath my feet. Houses collapsed as I passed them, their wooden frames erupting into sudden flame. The fire was spreading, chasing me, hungry. Finally, I saw it, the highway overpass at the edge of town. Sarah pointed one last time, then looked at me with such terrible sadness that I almost stopped running. Her mouth formed words I couldn't hear but somehow understood. I'm sorry. Then she turned and walked back toward the burning center of town, back toward the pit that had held her for so long, and disappeared into the smoke. I didn't stop running until I was on the overpass, until solid concrete was beneath my feet and the burning town was behind me. I collapsed against the guardrail, gasping for air, my entire body shaking. When I finally looked back at Centralia, I could see fires burning across the whole town now, flames rising from dozens of places where the ground had split open. And in the center, where the main pit was, something massive moved beneath the surface, something that made the earth itself tremble. A truck stopped beside me, the driver rolling down his window with concern on his face. He was an older man, probably in his 60s, with weathered skin and kind eyes. He asked if I was okay, if I needed help. I tried to explain what had happened, about the girl and the fire and the thing underneath the town. He just nodded slowly, like he heard stories like this before. He told me I was lucky. He said every few years, someone comes through Centralia at night and sees her, the girl in the yellow dress. Sarah Brennan had been exploring the abandoned mine shafts when the fire started in 1962. She'd gone down there looking for something, and she never came back out. The mine fire spread too fast to mount a rescue. They sealed the entrances, thinking the lack of oxygen would suffocate the flames. But the fire just kept burning, kept spreading, and Sarah stayed down there with it, trapped, becoming part of it somehow, part of the darkness and the heat and the endless burning. He said she shows herself to people sometimes, trying to lead them out before the fire takes them too. But sometimes she can, to save them. Sometimes the thing down there, the fire itself maybe, or something that lives in the fire, something old and hungry that was sleeping in those coal seams long before humans ever dug them up, claims them anyway. He told me about the cars they find sometimes in collapsed sections of town, burned beyond recognition, with no trace of the drivers. About the missing people who were last seen taking the Centralia exit late at night. About the sounds people hear coming from the ground, not just the roar of flames, but something else. Something that sounds almost like laughter. I spent the rest of that night in a motel 40 miles away, shaking and unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Sarah, his burning face and that massive shadow moving beneath the streets. I saw the cracks spreading under my feet and felt the heat rising from below, hungry and patient. It's been 3 months now. I made it out, but sometimes, late at night, I still smell sulfur. I still feel that heat rising from somewhere underneath. And worst of all, I sometimes see her in my dreams. Sarah Brennan in her yellow dress, standing at the foot of my bed, her mouth opened in that silent scream. She is trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. Because I think that when I stepped onto that burning ground in Centralia, when I walked those streets where the fire never stops, something marked me. Something down there noticed me. The fire is still burning. It could burn for another 100 years, maybe more. And Sarah is still down there, trapped between the flames and whatever lives in them, trying to save people from her fate. But I wonder sometimes, in those dark hours before dawn, if she is really trying to save us, or if she is trying to warn us about something worse. Something that has been sleeping in the darkness beneath Pennsylvania, feeding on fire and fear in the lost souls of a forgotten town. Because some fires, once started, can never be put out, and some places should never be disturbed. Story 4. Bell that rings in Bethel Hollow. I never believed in haunted places until I spent 3 nights in Bethel Hollow, Pennsylvania. What I found there still wakes me at exactly 3:14 every morning, drenched in sweat, listening for a sound that should not exist. Let me tell you something terrifying about small towns in this country. They die slowly, not all at once, but piece by piece, until what remains is just a shell wearing the skin of civilization. Bethel Hollow died sometime in the 80s, but nobody bothered to bury it. Population 73, according to a rusted sign on Route 14. I counted maybe 30 occupied houses during my entire stay. The rest stood empty, watching the street with dark windows like the eyes of something dead that refused to close. I drove into town on a Tuesday afternoon in October, chasing a story that seemed ridiculous even then. My editor at the Pittsburgh Tribune wanted a Halloween piece about dying towns and local legends. Easy money for a freelance writer between real assignments. The legend of Bethel Hollow was simple enough. An old Methodist church on Maple Street, abandoned since 1987. Its bell rang every night at 3:14 in the morning. No electricity, no mechanism, just a 2-ton bronze bell swinging in a tower that should have been silent for nearly 40 years. Local kids claimed it was haunted. Some said a pastor hung himself in the bell tower. Others whispered about a girl who died in the church basement during a youth group meeting, her screams unheard over the Sunday morning service happening upstairs. The stories varied, but the bell remained constant. Every night, 3:14, like clockwork, I pulled into the Hollow Creek Motel around 4 in the afternoon. The place looked like it was built in 1952 and cleaned maybe twice since then. A woman in her 60s sat behind bulletproof glass, smoking a cigarette despite the no smoking sign directly behind her head. She took my credit card without speaking, slid me a key attached to a wooden paddle with the number 7 burned into it, and returned to watching a small television that showed only static. The room smelled like mildew and something else, something organic and disturbing that I could not quite identify. I opened the window, letting in the October air, crisp and cold with the promise of an early winter. From my room, I could see the church. It sat on a small hill at the end of Maple Street, white paint peeling like diseased skin, its steeple rising against a gray sky. The bell tower was open on all 4 sides, and I could see the dark shape of the bell hanging there, motionless and waiting. I spent the evening walking the town, talking to whoever would speak with me. Most people avoided eye contact. The few who acknowledged my presence offered short, clipped responses before finding reasons to end the conversation. An old man sitting on a bench outside the defunct post office told me to leave before dark. When I asked why, he just shook his head and walked away, moving faster than someone his age should have been able to move. The sun set early, swallowed by thick clouds that promised rain. I grabbed dinner at a diner called Martha's, the only restaurant still operating in town. 6 people sat scattered across cracked vinyl booths, all of them silent, all of them eating alone. The waitress brought me coffee and a burger without asking what I wanted. The meat tasted strange, and I left most of it untouched. Back in my motel room, I set 3 alarms, one for 3 in the morning, one for 3:10, and one for 3:13. I wanted to be awake and alert when the bell rang. I wanted to record it, to capture proof of whatever phenomenon made that bell move. My digital recorder sat on the nightstand, ready. My camera pointed toward the window with a clear view of the church. Sleep came hard. The room made noises it should not have made, creaking in the walls, scratching beneath the floor. At one point, I heard footsteps in the hallway outside my door, slow and deliberate, stopping right at my threshold. I held my breath, waiting, but nobody knocked. The footsteps eventually continued, fading into a silence that felt heavier than the sounds had been. My first alarm woke me at 3. I silenced it quickly and moved to the window, camera in hand. The street was empty. No lights in any windows. No cars, no movement at all. The darkness felt thick, almost tangible, pressing against the glass. The church sat on its hill, a pale shape against the black sky. I could just barely make out the bell in the tower, hanging still and silent. 3:10. Nothing. 3:13. I held my breath, finger on the record button of my camera, the digital recorder running on the nightstand. The town around me was so quiet I could hear my own heartbeat, a dull thunder in my ears. Then, at exactly 3:14, the bell rang. The sound was not what I expected. I had imagined something distant, muffled by age and weather. But this was loud, impossibly loud. It filled the room, filled my head, vibrated in my chest and teeth and bones. A single, long toll that seemed to last forever, echoing off the empty buildings, rolling through the streets like a physical thing. I watched through my camera. This viewfinder zoomed in on the tower. The bell was swinging, slowly, deliberately, back and forth. I could see no ropes, no mechanism, nothing pulling it, just that massive piece of bronze moving through the air as if pushed by invisible hands. The toll faded, but the bell continued swinging for several more seconds before gradually coming to rest. Then silence returned, deeper and more unsettling than before. I checked my recorder. It had captured everything. I had proof, but proof of what? I barely slept the rest of that night. When dawn finally came, gray and reluctant, I took my equipment to the church. The building looked worse up close. The wooden steps leading to the front door were rotted through in places. The door itself hung crooked on rusted hinges. A sign nailed to the wall read condemned, no trespassing. The date on the notice was from 1987. I am not proud of what I did next. I pushed open that door and went inside. The interior was chaos. Pews lay scattered and broken, as if thrown by some tremendous force. Hymnals covered the floor, their pages yellowed and torn. Graffiti covered the walls, but not the usual teenage vandalism. These were strange symbols, circles within circles, words in a language I did not recognize. The air inside was cold, much colder than it should have been, and it carried that same organic smell from my motel room, stronger now, almost overwhelming. A narrow stairway led up to the bell tower. The steps were wooden and looked dangerously unstable, but I needed to see. I needed to understand how that bell could ring with no mechanism to move it. The stairs creaked under my weight, and more than once I thought they would give way, sending me crashing down into the darkness below. But they held, barely, and I climbed into the tower. The bell hung in the center of the space, suspended from a massive wooden beam. I walked around it slowly, examining every angle. There was no rope, no motor, no mechanism of any kind. Just the bell, hanging from its mount, waiting. I reached out to touch it, and the metal was ice cold, cold enough to burn. I pulled my hand back with a gasp. That is when I noticed the scratches. Deep gouges in the wooden floor of the tower, forming a circle around the bell. They looked fresh, the exposed wood still pale. And inside the circle, something else. Dark stains that could have been old paint but probably were not. They formed a pattern, deliberate and intentional, leading from the edge of the circle to directly beneath the bell. I took photographs of everything, dozens of them, documenting every detail. Then I heard something below me. Footsteps in the church, slow, methodical, coming toward the stairs. Fear hit me like a physical blow. I was trespassing in a condemned building, and somebody had caught me. I moved toward the stairs, ready to explain myself, ready to apologize. But when I looked down, I saw nothing. The footsteps continued, closer now, climbing toward me. I could hear each individual step, the creak of wood, the weight of something ascending. But I saw nothing. The footsteps reached the top of the stairs. They stopped. I stood frozen, barely breathing, staring at the empty space where something should have been. The temperature dropped even further. My breath came out in visible clouds. Then the bell rang. One single toll, deafening in the enclosed space. I fell to my knees, hands over my ears, camera clattering across the floor. The bell had not moved. It hung perfectly still, but the sound had come from it, impossible and terrifying. I ran. I scrambled down those stairs, nearly falling twice, and burst out of the church into the pale morning light. My heart hammered so hard I thought it might tear through my ribs. Behind me, the church stood silent again, as if nothing had happened. I spent that day trying to convince myself I had imagined it. Stress, lack of sleep, an overactive imagination fed by local legends. But I had recordings. I had photographs. I had evidence of something I could not explain. That second night, I was ready. I set up my equipment more carefully, pointing multiple cameras at the church from different angles. I wore headphones connected to a sensitive microphone aimed at the bell tower. If the bell rang, I would hear it and record it from multiple sources simultaneously. 3:14 came. The bell rang, exactly as before. But through my microphone, I heard something else underneath the tolling. Something that made my blood turn to ice. Voices, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, all speaking at once in a low murmur beneath the sound of the bell. I could not make out individual words, but the tone was clear. They were afraid. They were begging. The next morning, I went to the town library, a tiny building that shared space with the fire department. A librarian who looked like she had not seen another patron in months helped me find old newspaper archives. I spent hours reading about Bethel Hollow, piecing together a story that nobody wanted to tell me directly. The church had closed in 1987, but not because of declining membership. It closed because of what happened on October 23rd of that year. During a Sunday evening service, with 147 people in attendance, something went wrong. The official report said carbon monoxide poisoning from a faulty furnace. Everyone in the church died within minutes, but there were problems with that story. Carbon monoxide does not cause the kind of panic described by the first responders. It does not make people claw at walls hard enough to break their fingernails. It does not make them scream until their vocal cords rupture. And it does not explain why the church bell rang continuously for 3 hours after everyone was already dead. The town never recovered. People moved away. Those who stayed did not talk about it. The church was condemned and left to rot, a monument to something nobody wanted to remember. And every night since then, at 3:14 in the morning, the exact time the congregation died, the bell rings. One toll for each person who died inside those walls. 147 tolls, compressed into a single, eternal sound. That final night, I made a decision. I would be inside the church when the bell rang. I would be there with my equipment, recording everything, capturing whatever truth hid in that cursed place. It was dangerous and probably stupid, but I needed to know. I needed to understand. I entered the church at midnight, giving myself time to set up. The darkness inside was absolute. My flashlight seemed almost useless against it, the beam swallowed by shadows that pressed in from all sides. I climbed back to the bell tower and positioned myself in the corner, cameras and recorders running, waiting for 3:14. The hours crawled past. The cold seeped into my bones. I heard sounds in the church below. Whispers. Movement. At one point, I heard what sounded like singing, faint and distant. Voices raised in a hymn I almost recognized. But when I checked, my recorder picked up nothing but silence. 3:14 approached. I watched the second hand on my phone tick closer. 10 seconds. 5. 3:14. The bell did not ring. Instead, I heard them. All of them. 147 voices. Suddenly clear and distinct, filling the tower around me. They were not speaking. They were screaming. Screaming in terror and agony. Screaming for help that would never come. Screaming as they died together in the darkness. And underneath it all, another sound. Something else. Something that was not human and had never been human. Speaking words that hurt to hear. Words that felt like they were carving themselves into my brain. The bell began to swing. Slowly at first, then faster, building momentum even though nothing touched it. The voices grew louder, more desperate, and I realized they were not memories or echoes. They were still here. Still dying, trapped in an eternal moment of death, replaying their final seconds over and over, forever. The bell swung faster. The voices reached a crescendo, and then I understood the final, horrible truth. The bell was not haunted by the dead. It was keeping them there. Some kind of anchor, binding their souls to this place, preventing them from moving on. And every night when it rang, it renewed that binding, trapped them again, made them relive their deaths in an endless cycle. I ran from that tower, leaving my equipment behind, fleeing that cursed place with those screams echoing in my head. I drove out of Bethel Hollow without stopping, without even grabbing my things from the motel. I just ran. That was 6 months ago. I never wrote the story, never published the recordings I managed to save. Nobody would believe it anyway. But every night at 3:14, I wake up. And in the silence of my apartment, 300 miles away, I hear it. Faint but unmistakable, the sound of that bell, still ringing, still binding, still keeping 147 souls trapped in their moment of death. And sometimes, in the pause between heartbeats, I hear them screaming. Story 5. Watching Woods. What if the thing you were most afraid of was never actually outside of you at all? That is the question that keeps me awake now. That is the terrifying truth I discovered in a small Pennsylvania town called Millbrook. And I'm going to tell you exactly what happened to me there, even though part of me doesn't want to. Even though every rational part of my brain keeps telling me it wasn't real. But I know what I saw. I know what I heard. And I know what I became. My name is David, and I'm 43 years old. I've lived a normal life. I have a decent job, a mortgage, a coffee maker that I use every morning. I am not the kind of person who sees things that aren't there. I am not prone to panic or wild imagination. I am cautious, practical, The kind of guy who double-checks the locks and trusts his instincts. And my instincts told me something was horrifyingly wrong in Millbrook the moment I drove past the welcome sign. I was driving through Pennsylvania on Route 80, heading back home to New Jersey after visiting my sister in Pittsburgh. It was October, that eerie time of year when the leaves turn red and brown and the days get shorter faster than seems natural. The sun was already setting at 5:30 in the afternoon, and I had about 2 more hours of driving ahead of me. I was tired, really tired. The kind of tired where your eyes feel heavy and your brain is fuzzy and you should probably pull over somewhere, but the thought of stopping in some random town keeps nagging at you. That is when I saw the sign for Millbrook. Population 843. The kind of forgotten place that exists all across America. A town that nobody really visits unless they re-lost or passing through. I took the exit without really thinking about it. I needed coffee and maybe some food. Maybe I'd stay the night if there was a motel. The decision seemed simple at the time. Looking back now, I realize I made a mistake. A chilling, horrifying mistake that would change everything about how I understand fear itself. The town appeared suddenly around a bend. Main Street was the kind of place that felt like it was stuck in the 1980s. Brick buildings with old storefronts, most of them closed or boarded up. A diner with a flickering neon sign. A gas station with pumps that looked ancient. And scattered along the buildings were dozens of security cameras, more cameras than I'd ever seen in a town this small. They were mounted on every corner, every storefront, every electrical pole. They were pointed at the streets, at the buildings, at each other. It was unsettling, the kind of thing that makes the back of your neck prickle with an inexplicable sense of danger. I pulled into the diner parking lot. There were only 2 other cars there, both of them looking like they hadn't been moved in years. I sat in my car for a moment, hands still on the steering wheel, feeling something creeping over me. An eerie sensation that I was being watched. That was stupid, I told myself. Of course I was being watched. There were cameras everywhere, but this feeling was different. This wasn't the awareness of mechanical surveillance. This was something more primal, something that made my primitive brain scream at me to start the car and drive away. I ignored that instinct. I got out of the car and walked into the diner. The inside was empty except for an old man sitting at the counter and a waitress who was reading a magazine. Both of them looked up at me when I entered, and I saw something in their eyes that I couldn't quite place. Was it fear? Warning? Curiosity? Their expressions were difficult to read, but they both looked away quickly, as if they didn't want to make eye contact with a stranger. I sat at a booth near the window and ordered coffee and a sandwich. The food was decent but cold, like it had been sitting under a heat lamp for too long. I tried to make small talk with the waitress, asking her what the town was like, if there were any motels nearby. She answered my questions in short sentences, her voice quiet and monotone. When I asked about the cameras, she stiffened. Safety, she said. It's important here. Safety from what? I asked. She didn't answer. She just walked away, leaving me alone with my cold sandwich and my growing sense of unease. I paid the bill and asked for directions to the nearest motel. The waitress pointed me toward the edge of town, saying there was a place called the Shady Pines about a mile down the road. Her tone made it clear the conversation was over. I left a tip anyway and headed back to my car. That horrible creeping feeling of being watched following me out into the darkening evening. The Shady Pines Motel was exactly as depressing as the name suggested. A single-story building that formed a U-shape around a cracked parking lot. The office was a small building near the entrance, and I could see a light on inside. I pulled up and went in to get a room. The guy behind the desk didn't even look up from his phone when I walked in. I had to ring a bell on the counter to get his attention. "One night?" he asked, finally glancing at me. "Yeah, just one night." He nodded and slid a key across the counter. "Room 12, cash only, $40. I paid him and headed toward my assigned room, pulling my car around to park directly in front of it. The motel was eerily quiet. I couldn't see anyone else anywhere. No other cars, no other people, just the sound of my footsteps on the cracked asphalt and the distant hum of the office, this flickering neon sign. I unlocked the door to room 12 and stepped inside. The room was clean enough but dated, with wood-paneled walls and a double bed that sagged slightly in the middle. There was a television that looked like it hadn't been updated since the Clinton administration, and a small window with curtains that had probably been white once but were now a grimy beige color. I didn't bother unpacking anything. I just collapsed on the bed, fully clothed, and stared at the ceiling. I couldn't sleep. Not because I was uncomfortable, but because that eerie, terrifying feeling of being watched hadn't. It left me. It had intensified. I lay there in the darkness, listening to the silence of the town outside, and I felt like something was looking at me. Not through the window, not from outside the room, but like I was being observed by some presence that I couldn't quite perceive. Around midnight, I heard something that made my blood go cold. Footsteps. Someone was walking slowly past my motel room. I got up and looked out the window, peering through a gap in the curtains. There was a figure walking across the parking lot. It was too dark to see clearly, but from what I could make out, it appeared to be a man wearing dark clothing. He was walking slowly, methodically, looking at each motel room as he passed. When he reached my room, he stopped. He stood there, right in front of my window, for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 30 seconds. I couldn't see his face. Darkness obscured his features completely, but I could feel him looking at the window, feel his gaze trying to penetrate the glass in the curtains. I held my breath, pressed myself against the wall so he couldn't see me, and waited. Then he moved on. He continued down the line of rooms, stopping at each one, looking, and moving on. When he reached the end of the motel, he disappeared into the darkness beyond. I didn't sleep that night. I sat on the bed with the lights on, watching the window, listening for any sound. Around 3 a.m, I heard the footsteps again. This time, there were multiple people, 3 of them, maybe 4, walking slowly through the parking lot. They moved without speaking, without making any unnecessary noise, just the sound of their footfalls on the asphalt, deliberate and methodical. I watched through the curtains as shadows moved past my window. They stopped at my room again. All of them stood there, facing my window, and I felt that horrible sensation of being observed by something dangerous, something hungry. When they finally left, I made a decision. I was getting out of this town at dawn. I didn't care about the time. I didn't care about being tired. I was going to pack my things, get in my car, and drive away from Millbrook as fast as I possibly could. But before dawn came, something even more terrifying happened. I heard something that I can only describe as scratching. Long, deliberate scratching sounds coming from the walls, not like animals, like fingernails being dragged across something hard, slowly, methodically. The sound started near the window and traveled along the wall toward the corner, then across the other wall, and back again. It was deliberate, purposeful. Whoever was making that sound was trying to terrify me, and it was working. I jumped off the bed and turned on every light in the room. The scratching stopped. I waited, heart pounding, expecting it to start again. It didn't. The silence that followed was somehow worse than the scratching. The silence felt loaded with intention. The silence felt like something was waiting for me to let my guard down. I didn't turn off the lights. I sat on the bed, watching the walls, waiting for something to happen. When the sun finally started to rise, painting the room in gray pre-dawn light, I felt the first real sense of relief I experienced since arriving in Millbrook. I grabbed my things and rushed to my car. I didn't even return the key. I just got in, started the engine, and drove toward the highway as fast as I could without getting pulled over. I didn't look in my rearview mirror. I didn't look at the town. I just pointed my car east and drove. But here is where the story gets more disturbing, and this is where I need to tell you something that has haunted me ever since that night. Something that makes me question everything about what happened and why it happened. 2 hours into my drive, I stopped at a rest area to use the bathroom and splash some water on my face. I was exhausted, running on pure adrenaline and fear. As I was sitting in a stall in the bathroom, I heard 2 men come in and stand at the urinals. They were talking about Millbrook. I froze, listening. "Did you see the guy in room 12? One of them said. "Yeah, I saw him." Looked scared as hell. "That's the whole point, ISN, to it. That is why we do it." I thought, seems wrong somehow. The guy didn't even do anything. Doesn't matter. The woods always know who to pick. The woods always know who comes here. And when someone new arrives, we have to see if they were one of the ones the woods wants. The conversation moved on to other topics, but my entire body had gone numb. The woods always knows who comes here. The woods always knows. What did that mean? I sat in that bathroom stall for another 20 minutes. Not moving, not making a sound, trying to process what I had just heard. When I finally left, those 2 men were nowhere to be seen. But I couldn't shake what they had said. I drove for hours, trying to rationalize it, trying to convince myself that I had misheard them or that they were just locals trying to scare a stranger who had gotten spooked by their little midnight pranks. That is all it had been, right? A sick game these townspeople played on travelers. But I knew better. Deep down, in that part of me that knew the difference between normal and not normal, I knew something else had happened. Something that didn't have an easy explanation. I didn't go back to Millbrook. I tried to forget about it. For months, I tried to convince myself that the whole experience was just the result of stress and exhaustion and an overactive imagination fueled by one too many horror stories. But then, late last spring, I read something that changed everything. I was reading an article online about a school in Millbrook, Pennsylvania. The article was from a local news website, and it described how teachers at the school had recently implemented a new policy. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Parents had to pick them up from school or arrange for an authorized adult to do so. The reason given was vague. Safety concerns, precautions. But one section of the article caught my attention and made my blood run cold. The article mentioned that children had been reporting seeing figures watching them from the woods behind the school. Tall, shadowy figures that would stand among the trees, watching the children during recess and lunch. The teachers initially dismissed these reports as imagination and childhood games. But then more and more children reported the same thing. Not just the same story, but identical details. The same height, the same positioning, the same unsettling sense of being observed by something that wasn't quite human. I spent the next 3 days researching Millbrook online, digging through archived articles, local news reports, anything I could find. And what I discovered was a pattern of unsettling incidents going back at least 50 years. Disappearances of teenagers who had been passing through or visiting. Strange scratching sounds reported by motel guests. A kind of collective unease that seemed to permeate the entire town. But there was something else too. Something even more disturbing. In the oldest articles, from the 1970s and 80s, there were references to something the local people called the selection. References to people who came to town and were chosen by something in the forest. References to ritualistic behavior. References to a presence in the woods that had been there longer than the town itself. And then I found an old book, published in 1952, that was about the history of that region of Pennsylvania. In a chapter about local folklore, there was a section about Millbrook and the surrounding area. The author described old colonial accounts of something that lived in the forests. Something that would appear to travelers and settlers. Something that would watch and wait and eventually claim people who came into its territory. The indigenous people of the region, according to this old text, had understood the presence. They had learned to coexist with it by understanding that it was a hunter, that it selected its prey based on something only it could recognize. Something about a person, this fear or loneliness or psychological vulnerability. I put the book down and tried not to think about what that meant. But here is the thing that really terrifies me, the thing that keeps me from finding peace about what happened. A few weeks after I read that article about the school in Millbrook, I started having dreams. Not nightmares exactly, strange, vivid dreams where I would be back in Millbrook, but I wasn't the visitor anymore. I was one of the figures in the shadows. I was standing in the forest, looking at other travelers, other people coming into town. And I could feel something in the woods with me, something that was old and patient and hungry. And most horrifying of all, I could feel that it was pleased with me. I haven't been able to shake those dreams. And recently, I started noticing things, small things. The way I become interested when I hear about Millbrook. The way I started driving past the town on purpose, telling myself I'm just curious about what's really going on there. The way I find myself thinking about that eerie feeling of being watched, and how comforting it would be to go back. To stop running from whatever was in those woods. Because I'm starting to understand that the thing in the forest doesn't need to keep me in town. It doesn't need me to physically return. What it did was mark me. It selected me. And now, wherever I am, it is watching. It is waiting. And somewhere deep inside me, the part of me that is now part of that darkness is waiting too. This is the horrifying truth I've come to accept. The thing in Millbrook, the presence in those woods, it wasn't just trying to scare me that night. It was testing me. It was seeing if I was the kind of person who could understand it. The kind of person who could become one of its servants. And against everything I believe about myself, against everything I want to be, I think I passed that test. So if you ever driving through Pennsylvania and you see a sign for Millbrook, keep driving. Keep your eyes on the road, Don, to stop for coffee or a room or anything else. Because the woods behind that town, those terrifying, eerie, creeping forests, they were always watching. They were always hungry. And once they selected you remarked forever. And if you ever start having dreams about standing in shadows and watching travelers, if you ever feel that horrible pull to go back, if you ever start to think that the fear in the darkness might actually feel like home, then you already know what I know. You've already been chosen. The real horror isn't in the watching. It is in the understanding. It is in realizing that whatever was in those woods, it is inside you now. And there is no running from something that is living in your own mind, in your own deepest, darkest thoughts. I don't know what is going to happen to me next. I don't know if I'll eventually give in to the pull and go back to Millbrook. But I know that every day, the thought of returning feels less frightening and more inevitable. The darkness has always known what it was doing. It is patient. It is hungry. And it is never going to let me go. Story 6. Abandoned farmhouse tapes. I found the tapes in the basement, and I knew immediately that I should have left them there. My name is Robert Chen. I am a documentary filmmaker, and about 2 years ago, I was driving through rural Pennsylvania looking for stories. Real stories. The kind that most people never find because they are too busy driving past abandoned buildings without wondering what happened inside them. I just finished a project on dead coal towns in Appalachia, and I was heading north when I saw it. An old farmhouse sitting alone on a hillside outside a town called Harmon. Population 800. The kind of place that barely appears on maps. The farmhouse wasn't remarkable at first glance. White siding, black roof, a porch that sagged under the weight of decades. But there was something about it that made me stop my car on the shoulder of the road. Something unsettling. The kind of feeling you get when you walk into a room and know immediately that something terrible happened there. The air around that place felt heavy, dead, like the world had forgotten it existed, and the farmhouse had been left behind as proof that something in reality had gone wrong. I pulled into the driveway and just sat in my car for 10 minutes, engine running, trying to convince myself to leave. But I didn't leave. I got out and walked toward that terrifying, creepy house. And I told myself it was for the documentary. That I was doing research. That I was just gathering material. The truth was darker than that. The truth was that the house was calling me. I felt it then, though I didn't understand what it meant. I feel it now in a way that is much clearer and much more horrifying. The front door was unlocked. I remember being surprised by that. Most abandoned farmhouses have been picked clean by drifters or sealed up by concerned neighbors. But this door swung open with barely a push, and I stepped into a hallway that smelled like dust and something else. Something organic and wrong. Like old meat. Like the inside of a grave. The main floor was empty. No furniture, no decorations. Nothing to suggest that anyone had lived there in decades. But the walls told a different story. The wallpaper was peeling. Yes, but underneath the peeling patterns, I could see marks where pictures had hung. Dark silhouettes. Rectangles of discoloration. A family had lived here. A normal family in a normal farmhouse. And then something had changed that. Something had made them leave. Or something had taken them away. I found the basement door in the kitchen. And here is where the terrifying part begins. The door was newer than the rest of the house. Recent. The hinges were clean, and there was no dust on the wooden frame. The eerie basement door looked like it had been installed in the last few years, maybe even more recently than that. Someone had been maintaining this house. Someone had been coming back. The basement stairs creaked under my weight. The darkness grew thicker as I descended, and my flashlight beam felt pathetic against it. The walls down there were stone, and they were sweating. Moisture dripped from overhead. The air tasted like iron and something chemical. I remember thinking that I should turn back. That this was exactly the moment in a horror movie when someone makes the stupid decision to keep going deeper into the scary, haunted building instead of running away. I kept going anyway. The basement opened into a large space that had been finished at some point, probably in the 70s or 80s. There was old carpet on the floor, a workbench covered in tools, boxes stacked against the walls, and on a small wooden shelf in the corner, I saw them. Cassette tapes, dozens of them, old audio cassettes in faded plastic cases. They looked ancient, but they were arranged carefully, almost reverently, like someone had organized them regularly. like someone had been preserving them. I picked one up. The label was handwritten. All of them were handwritten. The dates went back to 1987. That first tape was labeled only with a name. Margaret, no date, just that name. Written in neat, precise script. I should have left the tapes there. I should have gone back to my car and driven away from that farmhouse and never thought about it again. But I was a documentarian. I was someone who believed that truth was worth pursuing, that stories needed to be told, that understanding required us to look at difficult things. So I found an old tape deck in a box near the tapes, and I brought both upstairs to the kitchen where there was still some natural light. The tape deck worked. Batteries still had some charge, which was impossible. Those batteries should have been dead for years. But the machine clicked to life, and I inserted the first tape labeled Margaret. The sound that came through the speaker was a woman's voice. But something was wrong with it. The voice was distorted, like it was coming from very far away, or like it had been recorded underwater. It was the eerie, unsettling sound of someone speaking from inside a wall. She was saying something about the garden, about how the tomatoes had grown well that year, about how her husband had built a new fence. Simple things, normal things, mundane observations about rural life. But her voice contained something that made my skin crawl. It wasn't the emotion exactly. It was the absence of emotion. It was a voice that had forgotten what it meant to be human. It was speaking the words that humans speak, but it was doing so from somewhere that humans done to exist. The creepy, disturbing monologue continued for 4 minutes, talking about the seasons and the crops and the neighbor down the road, all of it delivered in that flat, hollow, nightmarish tone. When the tape ended, I sat in silence. My hands were shaking, my mouth was dry. I told myself it was some kind of avant-garde art project, a creative exercise, something that had nothing to do with horror or fear or anything genuinely frightening. But I didn't believe myself. I played another tape. This one was labeled 1988. Thomas. The voice was different, but it had the same terrifying quality. A man's voice. Deeper. Also hollow. Also wrong. He was talking about sitting on the porch in the morning, watching the sun rise over the hills. Watching the road stretch out in the distance. Waiting for something. Always waiting. The way he said the word waiting made it sound like an obsession. Like a curse. Like he'd been waiting for years and would wait for years more. I played another, and another. The tape spanned from 1987 to 2003. 16 years of recordings, each one labeled with a name and a date. Different voices, but all of them sharing that same haunting, unsettling quality. That same sense that they were speaking from somewhere outside of normal reality. That they were describing normal, ordinary things, but from a perspective that was fundamentally wrong. Some of the voices were children's voices, high and thin and disturbing in their flatness. A boy talking about his baseball card collection. A girl describing her school day. But their voices had that eerie quality too, like they were puppets speaking words they'd been taught to speak. Like the real people had disappeared and something else was wearing their voices like masks. The final tape in the collection was labeled 2003. Margaret and Thomas and all the rest. I didn't want to play it. I had this terrifying sense that playing it would be a mistake. That some things, once heard, cannot be unheard. That some doors, once opened, cannot be closed. But I played it anyway. What I heard on that tape would change everything I believed about what was possible in this world. The tape contained all of the voices, layered over each other, speaking simultaneously. Dozens of voices, speaking in that same flat, hollow, eerie tone. And they were saying the same thing, over and over again. A single phrase, repeated hundreds of times, becoming more and more distorted as the tape went on. Come home, come home, come home. The voices grew louder, more urgent, more terrifying. The phrase shifted and twisted into other words. Stay here, Don, to leave, Don, to leave. The tape degraded into a sound that was barely human, a screaming that wasn't really screaming, a chorus of voices that had lost the ability to be voices anymore. Just raw, horrifying sound, raw, terrifying noise. The tape ended, and the farmhouse was silent. I sat there in the kitchen of that creepy, abandoned house for hours. I didn't move. I didn't think. I just existed in a state of profound fear and confusion. Eventually, darkness fell outside, and I realized I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that place before something happened that couldn't be reversed. But when I stood up, I found myself unable to walk to the door. My legs wouldn't to obey my mind. It was like the fear had physically paralyzed me. I forced myself to move. I walked to my car on legs that didn't feel like they belonged to me. I drove away from the farmhouse, and I didn't stop driving until I reached the next town. But even as I drove, I could hear the voices. The eerie, haunting chorus from that final tape. Come home, come home, come home. I tried to forget about the tapes for a week. I really did. I told myself they were some kind of hoax. A creative project abandoned years ago. Nothing to do with anything terrifying or real. But I couldn't stop thinking about them. So I did something I deeply regret. I went back to the farmhouse and retrieved all of the tapes. I brought them back to my apartment in Pittsburgh, and I spent 3 weeks listening to every single one. Documenting, transcribing, trying to understand what I was hearing. What I discovered was that the voices were changing. They were getting younger. In the tapes from 1987, the voices belonged to people in their 40s and 50s. But with each passing year, the voices became younger. By 2003, the final year of recordings, the voices sounded like they belonged to people in their 20s. Maybe even younger. It was like everyone in that farmhouse was aging backwards. It was like they were being unmade, rewritten, transformed into something else. And I discovered something else that was far more disturbing. In the background of every single tape, underneath the main voice, there was a scratching sound. A persistent, rhythmic scratching. Like something was being written. Like someone was recording these voices while simultaneously writing them down. Like the tapes were evidence of a process, a transformation, a horrifying, methodical program of change. I became obsessed. I started researching the farmhouse. I found property records dating back to 1952. The farmhouse was owned by a family named Brennan in 1987. Thomas and Margaret Brennan. 2 children, a normal family. And then, in 2004, the property changed hands. A developer named Mitchell Hess purchased it. According to the records, Hess had been a psychiatrist. He worked at a hospital in Harrisburg before going into private practice. And then, about 15 years ago, he simply disappeared. Vanished from public record. The farmhouse sat empty after that. Until someone started going back there regularly to maintain that basement door. Someone who kept the electricity on. Someone who cared about preserving what was in that basement. I hired a private investigator to look into Mitchell Hess. What I learned was terrifying. In his younger years, before he became a psychiatrist, Hess had been involved in an illegal psychological experiment. He'd been studying the nature of human consciousness, trying to understand what happened when you isolated someone completely from the world. What happened when you removed all external input and forced someone to create their own reality from nothing? The experiment had been shut down in the 1970s, but Hess had continued his work privately. The Brennan family was his laboratory. He kept them in that basement for years, only feeding them and giving them water. No external stimulation, no contact with the outside world. And he'd be given them one task. Describe what you re-experiencing. Record it. Tell me about the space you recreating in your mind. Tell me about the world you rebuilding when there's nothing to build it from. The tapes were their attempts to do this. Their attempts to create language and meaning from complete psychological isolation. Their voices were hollow because the people behind them had begun to disappear. They were being unmade by the absence of the external world. They were becoming something that wasn't quite human anymore. And then the scratching sound I heard underneath every tape, that wasn't the sound of writing. I learned that eventually. It was the sound of them fingernails clawing at the stone walls. It was the sound of desperation and madness and the complete dissolution of human sanity. The Brennan family was never found. Their bodies were never recovered. It's possible that Mitchell Hess killed them. It's possible that they simply stopped existing, that the process of isolation had erased them from reality itself. What I do know is that Hess disappeared in 2009, and the farmhouse has sat empty ever since. But someone still maintains it. Someone still keeps that basement dry. Someone still keeps that new door in good working order. I have the tapes in my apartment. They converted them to digital files. They listened to them hundreds of times. And they noticed something new with each listening. The voices are changing again. They re-aging forward now. The voices from the early tapes sound older than they did before. And the phrase they repeat at the end, that chilling chorus of come home, come home, come home, it is getting clearer, more articulate, more intentional. It's like the tape is aging forward, like it is progressing through time in a way that shouldn't be possible. Like the voices trapped inside it are becoming more real with each passing day. Last week, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. I answered it, and I heard nothing but static. But underneath the static, I could make out voices, multiple voices, speaking in unison, and I could hear my name being repeated over and over. Robert, Robert, Robert. I know what is happening now. I understand what the Brennan family understood too late. The process that has started, the experiment of complete isolation and psychological dissolution, it doesn't end. It continues, it spreads, and it passes through anything that carries the record of it, through the tapes, through anyone who listens to the tapes, through anyone who knows about the tapes. I am beginning to feel the dissolution myself. I am beginning to exist less and less in the normal world. I am becoming something else. My voice is changing. I can hear it. I sound more hollow each day. I sound more like the voices on those tapes. I sound like I am speaking from somewhere outside reality. The farmhouse in Harmon is waiting. The basement is waiting. The scratching sound continues even now, recording something new, recording my voice as it becomes hollow, recording the sound of my mind coming apart, recording the process of me becoming like the Brennan family, like all the others who have listened to these tapes and understood what they truly are. If you heard this story all the way to the end, then you know about the farmhouse. You know about the tapes. You know about Mitchell Hess and his terrible, horrifying experiment. And that means something has started inside you too. That means you heard the voices, at least through me. That means you beginning the process. The scratching continues. It has always been continuing. It never stopped. And now it's recording you as well. You can hear it underneath my voice. To you? That persistent, rhythmic scratching. The sound of desperation and dissolution being documented for eternity. Come home, come home, come home. The farmhouse is still standing. The basement is still there. The tapes are still playing. And they will continue to play forever, growing clearer and more articulate with each passing year, calling to everyone who has ever listened to them, calling them back to that place where isolation becomes identity, where absence becomes reality, where the mind unmakes itself and something darker takes its place. I don't have much time left before I have to go back. Before I have to descend into that basement and add my voice to the chorus. Before I become part of the recording. Before I become part of the terrifying, eerie, haunting legacy of the Brennan family and everyone else who came before me. The scratching is louder now. It's almost deafening. It's like fingernails on stone. It's like the sound of a mind being recorded as it dissolves. It's like the sound of horror itself being captured and preserved for eternity. Can you hear it too? Stay where you are. Dawn, to go looking for the farmhouse. Dawn, to try to listen to the tapes. Because if you do, you understand what I understand. You will hear what I hear. And you know with absolute certainty that there is no escape. There is only the slow, inevitable journey back to that basement. Back to that scratching sound. Back to the place where the voices continue forever, repeating their single, unsettling phrase. Come home, come home, come home. Story 7. Bridge locals avoid. The shadow in my rearview mirror had no source. I noticed it around midnight on Route 22, somewhere between nowhere and nothing in rural Pennsylvania. Just a dark shape moving independently of headlights or trees, keeping perfect pace with my truck. That should have been my first warning. The second came when my GPS went dead, the screen flickering once before displaying a message I'll never forget. Turn back. Bridge ahead. Then it died completely, leaving me alone on a 2-lane highway that stretched into absolute darkness. I am a long-haul trucker. Been driving these roads for 23 years, and I've seen plenty of weird, unsettling things at night. Deer with eyes that reflect wrong. Hitchhikers that vanish when you pass. Fog that moves against the wind. But this felt different. This felt like danger, real and immediate, waiting just beyond my headlights. The bridge appeared suddenly, emerging from the darkness like something out of a nightmare. Old steel and concrete, maybe 60 feet long, spanning a creek I couldn't see in the shadows below. No signs warning of weight limits or structural issues. No lights, nothing to indicate why my GPS had tried to steer me away. But locals must have known something, because in all my years driving through Pennsylvania, I had never seen this bridge before. And good with roads. I pride myself on knowing every shortcut, every alternate route, every forgotten piece of asphalt in the state. This bridge shouldn't exist. I slowed down, my truck, his engine dropping to a low rumble. The headlights swept across the structure, revealing something chilling. Flowers. Dozens of bouquets lined both sides of the bridge, some fresh, some withered to brown husks. Memorial crosses stood among them, white wood marked with names and dates. Too many names, too many dates, all clustered within the last 5 years. My stomach tightened as I read them in the harsh glare of my lights. Sarah Chen, 2019. Marcus Webb, 2020. The Patterson family, 2021. On and on. A horrifying timeline of death on a bridge that appeared on no map. I should have turned around. Every instinct, every rational thought screamed at me to back up and find another route. But the road behind me had changed. When I checked my mirrors, I saw only darkness, thick and absolute, as if the highway had simply ceased to exist the moment I approached the bridge. The shadow I had seen earlier now filled the entire road behind me, a wall of black that pulsed with something alive and hungry. Forward was my only option. I eased the truck onto the bridge, and immediately everything felt wrong. The steering wheel jerked in my hands, pulling hard to the right for no mechanical reason. I had this truck inspected 2 days ago. Everything was perfect. But now it fought me like something had grabbed the axle and was trying to drag me toward the rusted guardrail. I gripped tighter, muscles straining, sweat breaking out across my forehead despite the cold. The temperature had dropped. My breath came out in clouds, and frost began forming on the inside of my windshield in patterns that looked disturbingly like reaching hands. The radio, which had been silent since the GPS died, suddenly erupted with static. Through the white noise, I heard something that made my blood freeze. Screaming. Multiple voices, men and women and children, all crying out in terror and pain. Then, cutting through the chaos, words that were barely human, distorted and echoing. See us, join us, stay with us. My headlights flickered, once, twice, then steadied. But now they illuminated something impossible. People stood on the bridge ahead, dozens of them, just standing there in the middle of the road, blocking my path. They wore clothes from different eras. A woman in a dress from the 50s. A man in an 80s business suit. A family in modern athletic wear. A child, a soccer ball still clutched in small hands. None of them moved. They just stared at my approaching truck with eyes that reflected my headlights like animals, bright and empty and horrifying. I laid on the horn. The sound seemed to die the moment it left my truck, swallowed by the eerie atmosphere of the bridge. The figures didn't react, didn't move, didn't blink. I was 50 feet away, 40, 30. I couldn't stop now. The truck was moving too fast, and something about the bridge, its surface made it feel like I was sliding on ice, even though the pavement was dry. 20 feet, 10. I closed my eyes, bracing for impact. Nothing. When I opened my eyes, the road ahead was empty. The people had vanished as if they never existed. But in my rearview mirror, I saw them now standing where I had just been, still staring, still motionless, growing smaller as I continued to cross the bridge. Relief flooded through me, followed immediately by a new wave of terror as my truck suddenly lurched sideways. The steering wheel spun violently, ripping itself from my hands. The truck careened toward the guardrail, and I heard the screech of metal scraping metal, saw sparks flying in the darkness. I grabbed the wheel again, fighting against whatever force was controlling my vehicle, my arms burning with the effort. The truck tilted, 2 wheels lifting off the pavement, and for one horrifying second, I was sure I was going over the side. Then something changed. The resistance stopped. The wheel moved freely again. The truck dropped back onto all 4 wheels with a bone-jarring crash that made my teeth click together. I gunned the engine, desperate to reach the far side of the bridge, to get back onto normal road where the laws of physics still applied. But I wasn't moving forward anymore. Despite the engine roaring, despite the speedometer showing 60 miles per hour, the end of the bridge stayed the same distance away. I was driving in place, trapped on this nightmare span of steel and concrete, going nowhere. And the shadow in my mirrors was growing larger, darker, more solid. It had eyes now, hundreds of them, all watching me with patient hunger. The radio static resolved into words again, clearer this time, and I realized with chilling certainty that I was hearing the final moments of every person who had died on this bridge. Their last words, their last screams, recorded somehow in the structure itself, playing on an endless loop. A man begging his brakes to work, a woman crying for her children, a teenager realizing too late that something was wrong with his steering. No mechanical failures, a new voice said, cutting through the others. This one sounded official, detached, like a police report being read aloud. Investigation found no mechanical failures. No ice, no wet conditions, no reason for the accident. Multiple witnesses reported seeing the same thing. A shadow on the bridge. A shadow that moved. The shadow was inside my truck now. I could feel it, cold and heavy, pressing against my back, wrapping around my chest, making it hard to breathe. In the rearview mirror, I saw it taking shape behind me. A figure, human but wrong. Too tall and too thin, made of darkness so complete it seemed to absorb light. It leaned forward, and I felt breath on my neck that smelled of rust and decay and old fear. My hands were no longer my own. I watched in horror as they turned the steering wheel hard to the right, guiding the truck toward the guardrail, toward the drop below, toward the same fate as all those names on the crosses. I fought it with everything I had, every ounce of strength and will, but the shadow was stronger. It wanted me. It wanted my terror, my final moments, my addition to its collection of souls trapped forever on this cursed bridge. The guardrail rushed toward me. I could see the creek below now, dark water flowing between steep banks lined with rocks. This was where they all ended up. All those people, all those families, dragged off the road by something that shouldn't to exist, something that fed on accidents and tragedy and death. Then I remembered something my grandfather told me years ago, back when I was just starting as a driver. He was a trucker too, drove these same Pennsylvania roads for 40 years. One night over beers, he mentioned a bridge, a haunted bridge where people died for no reason, where locals knew to avoid driving after dark. He said the bridge wanted fear. It fed on terror, but it couldn't take you if you weren't afraid. I closed my eyes. In that moment, with death seconds away, I made myself stop fighting. I let go of the fear. I let go of the horror. I accepted whatever came next with a calmness I possessed. I thought of my daughter, her laugh, her smile. I thought of summer days and cold beer and the satisfying feeling of the long haul completed. I filled my mind with good things, pushing out the creeping dread that had consumed me. The truck stopped, not gradually, but instantly, like someone had hit pause on reality. When I opened my eyes, I was past the bridge. The end of it sat behind me, growing smaller in my mirrors, the shadow dissipating into ordinary darkness. My hands were back on the wheel, my own again. The radio played normal static. The temperature returned to comfortable. Everything was normal except for the scratches along the side of my truck where I had scraped the guardrail. Proof that what happened was real. I drove for an hour before I pulled into a truck stop, my hands still shaking, my heart still racing. Inside, I asked the waitress about the bridge. She went pale, her eyes darting to the other late-night customers before she leaned in close. "You crossed it?" she whispered. "You actually crossed it and lived?" I nodded, and she made the sign of the cross. She told me what locals knew but never spoke about to outsiders. The bridge was cursed, had been since it was built in 1952. Something went wrong during construction. A worker fell into the wet concrete, and they never recovered the body. Just poured over him and finished the job. His spirit, she said, was angry, hungry. It reached out from beyond, causing accidents, claiming lives, growing stronger with each death. Lots of people try to cross it, she said, especially truckers who know the area. Most of them end up in that creek. The ones who survive always say the same thing. They saw a shadow. They lost control for no reason. No mechanical failures, the police always say. No explanation. But we know, everyone around here knows, that bridge is evil. It's alive. And it's always hungry. I thanked her and left. Got back in my truck and drove straight through to my destination. No stops, no rest. I reported the bridge to the state police, gave them the location as best I could remember. They checked their records and told me no such bridge existed on Route 22. They pulled up satellite imagery. Nothing, just forest where I knew, with absolute certainty, a bridge full of ghosts waited for the next unsuspecting driver. That was 3 years ago. I still drive trucks, still cross Pennsylvania, but they changed my routes. I avoid that stretch of highway, even though I can find it on any map, even though GPS says it doesn't exist. Because I know the truth. I know the bridge is real. I know the shadow waits there in the darkness, patient and hungry, growing stronger with each life it claims. And I know, with chilling certainty, that one day my luck will run out. One day, My route will take me back to that cursed stretch of road. One day, I'll see those memorial crosses again, those flowers marking tragedy after tragedy. And when that happens, I'm not sure even my grandfather, this advice will save me a second time. Because the shadow remembers me. I can feel it sometimes, late at night when I'm driving through darkness. A cold spot in my truck, a flicker in my peripheral vision, a presence that whispers I got away. But it's not finished with me yet. The bridge locals avoid still stands somewhere in Pennsylvania, still claims lives, still feeds on fear and terror and the horrifying moment when drivers realize something is terribly, impossibly wrong. And somewhere out there, in the darkest part of night, the shadow waits for its next victim. Maybe it's waiting for me. Story 8. Town with no name. I found a town in Pennsylvania that doesn't exist on any map. Not on Google, not on GPS, not even on paper maps from before the internet. But it's real. I've been there, and I know now why they erased it from every record, why they wanted the world to forget it ever existed. The terrifying truth is this. Some places become so soaked in horror and violence that they develop their own dark consciousness, their own hunger. And this forgotten town in the mountains of Pennsylvania is one of them. I am a freelance journalist, always chasing stories about abandoned places and forgotten history. Last month, I came across a reference in an old newspaper archive from 1977. Just one line, buried in a larger article about mining accidents. The incident in Redacted has been contained. The town name had been blacked out, censored. Every other mention I found was the same. Redacted, erased, like someone had systematically removed every trace of this place from the historical record. That's what made me obsessive. I had to know what happened there. What was so disturbing that an entire town needed to be wiped from existence? After weeks of research, I found an elderly woman in Harrisburg who remembered the place. Her hands shook when I mentioned it, and fear darkened her eyes in a way that made my skin crawl. She wouldn't tell me the town. This real name, said speaking it out loud, was dangerous, but she told me how to find it. A specific dirt road off Route 219, marked by 3 dead oak trees that had been struck by lightning years ago. She said the town was still there, still standing, but nobody went there anymore. Nobody who valued their sanity or their soul. She called it the nameless place. The town that chose to die rather than spread. I should have recognized the warning. But journalists are curious by nature, and curiosity is a disease that doesn't care about danger. So I drove north into the mountains, following her directions, watching the GPS signal fade as I climbed higher into regions where civilization thinned and the forests grew thick and ancient. I found the 3 dead oaks exactly where she said they'd be. Lightning scarred and skeletal, they pointed toward a narrow dirt road that didn't appear on any map. The road was overgrown but passable, winding through dense woods where the shadows seemed darker than they should be, even in late afternoon. The deeper I drove, the more unsettling everything became. No birds sang, no squirrels rustled in the undergrowth, just eerie silence and the crunch of my tires on gravel. Then I saw the sign. Faded, bullet-riddled, nearly swallowed by vines. It had once displayed a town name, but someone had taken a blowtorch to it, melting the letters into unreadable metal scars. Underneath, spray painted in shaking letters. Turn around. Forget this place. I didn't turn around. The town appeared suddenly, as if the forest had been hiding it. One moment I was driving through trees. The next I was on Main Street of a place frozen in 1977. Old cars rusted in driveways. Stores with their windows intact still displayed faded merchandise behind dusty glass. Houses stood with their doors closed and curtains drawn. Everything looked preserved, waiting, like the whole town had just stepped away for an hour and never came back. But something was wrong. Deeply, horrifyingly wrong. Every surface was covered in the same symbol, a spiral with 7 lines radiating from the center, painted or carved or scratched into wood, metal, concrete. On walls, on sidewalks, on car hoods, on telephone poles. Hundreds of them, maybe thousands, covering every available surface like a desperate warning or a mad obsession. I parked in front of what used to be the town hall. The building was larger than the others, brick construction with tall windows. The spiral symbol covered the entire front wall, painted in what looked like rust-colored paint, or dried blood. I convinced myself it was paint. The front door was unlocked. Inside, The air was stale and heavy, thick with dust and something else, something organic and rotten that made my stomach turn. The lobby was ordinary enough. A reception desk, chairs, bulletin boards still covered in notices from 1977. But every single notice had been defaced with that same spiral symbol. I found the town records in the basement, file cabinets full of documents, newspapers, photographs. I started reading, and the story that emerged was the stuff of nightmares. The town had been called Ashford Mills, population 891. A quiet mining community that had existed since the 1800s. Nothing remarkable until October 1977, when something happened during the night shift at the old mine. The newspaper accounts were fragmentary and disturbing. 17 miners went down that evening. Only 3 came back up. They were covered in blood and screaming about something they found in a collapsed tunnel, something old and sleeping that they accidentally woken up. The 3 survivors were taken to the town doctor. By morning, all 3 were dead. The doctor's report, which I found in a medical file, described symptoms that made no medical sense. Rapid cellular degeneration, psychological breaks, and something he called consciousness fragmentation. He wrote that in their final hours, the miners claimed they could hear everyone's thoughts, that boundaries between minds were dissolving, that something was spreading through the town like an infection of awareness. Within a week, half the town was exhibiting similar symptoms. People started claiming they could feel what others felt, know what others knew. Privacy of thought disappeared. Secrets became impossible. The town, this collective consciousness began merging into something else, something unified and deeply disturbed by what it was discovering about itself. The psychological horror of it was crushing. Imagine knowing every dark thought your neighbors ever had, every hidden hatred, every secret violence, every perverse desire. All of it exposed, all of it shared, all of it becoming part of a singular awareness that couldn't forget or forgive. That is when the violence started. The newspaper articles became increasingly desperate and incoherent. Murder-suicides, families killing each other, neighbors turning on neighbors. The shared consciousness had revealed too much darkness, too many terrible truths, and the town had turned on itself in an orgy of horrifying retribution. The last newspaper was dated October 31st, 1977. The headline simply read, "We choose silence." Below was an article explaining that the remaining citizens had made a collective decision. They would end the contagion. They would make sure it never spread beyond Ashford Mills. They would erase themselves and their town from history, becoming nameless and forgotten, so that whatever they awoken in that mine would have nowhere to spread. The article ended with a chilling declaration. If you, rereading this, leave immediately. The consciousness is still here, still waiting, still hungry for new minds to absorb. I was so absorbed in reading that I didn't notice the change at first. But slowly, gradually, I became aware of a presence. Not a physical presence, but something else. A pressure inside my skull, like the beginning of a terrible headache. And with it came thoughts that weren't my own. I could feel them, the people of Ashford Mills. Not ghosts exactly, but residual consciousness. Fragments of awareness that had never truly died. They were still here, trapped in this forgotten place. Their merged minds forming something that lurked in every shadow, every darkened room, every silent building. And now they were reaching for me. The invasion started subtly. Memories that weren't mine began surfacing. I remembered killing my wife in a kitchen I'd never seen. I remembered the weight of a gun in my hand and the look of betrayal in my daughter's eyes before I pulled the trigger. I remembered the taste of poison and the feeling of a rope around my neck. Dozens of deaths, hundreds of murders, all the horror of Ashford Mills, this final days flowing into my consciousness like poison into a wound. I ran, burst out of the town hall and sprinted toward my car, but the presence followed, pressing harder against my mind. I could feel it trying to merge with me, trying to add my consciousness to its collection. The pressure became agony, splitting my thoughts, fragmenting my sense of self. I reached my car and fumbled with the keys, hands shaking so badly I could barely grip them. In the rearview mirror, I saw something that made my blood freeze. People were emerging from the buildings, dozens of them, but they moved wrong, all in perfect synchronization, like puppets controlled by a single hand. Their faces were blank, their eyes empty, and all of them were walking toward me with that same unified, purposeful stride. They weren't individuals anymore. They were extensions of the town, this consciousness, physical vessels for the hungry awareness that had consumed Ashford Mills. And they wanted me to join them, to become part of their eternal, nightmarish communion. I got the car started and floored it, tires spinning in the dirt. The synchronized crowd broke into a run, still moving in perfect unison, their footsteps creating a single thunderous rhythm. I didn't look back. I focused on the road ahead, on getting away from that cursed place, even as the pressure in my skull intensified to the point where I thought my head would explode. The attack on my mind grew desperate as I approached the town limits. I could feel the consciousness trying to plant seeds in my thoughts, trying to establish a connection that would last beyond my escape. Images flooded my vision. The spiral symbol, the merged faces of the townspeople, the darkness in the mind where it all began. And underneath it all, a command that echoed through every fiber of my being. Remember US. Speak our name, bring others. I crossed the town limits and the pressure released so suddenly I almost crashed. My head cleared, my thoughts became my own again, and the terrifying presence faded to a distant whisper. But I knew it wasn't gone. Part of it had latched onto me, a small fragment of that hungry consciousness hiding in the depths of my mind. I drove for hours, putting as much distance between myself and that nameless town as possible. When I finally stopped at a motel outside Pittsburgh, I checked myself in the mirror. My eyes looked haunted, my face pale and drawn. But worse than my appearance were the thoughts that kept surfacing. Memories of people I never met. Knowledge of secrets I shouldn't know. And the constant, nagging urge to go back, to return to Ashford Mills and let the consciousness complete what it started. That was 3 weeks ago. I haven't been back, but I think about it constantly. The pull grows stronger every day. I dream about that town every night, walking its empty streets, feeling the presence surround me like a warm embrace. In my dreams, I'm not afraid. In my dreams, being part of the collective consciousness feels right, feels natural, feels like coming home. I know what is happening. The fragment they planted in my mind is growing, spreading, slowly turning my consciousness into something compatible with theirs. Soon, I want to be able to resist the call. Soon, I'll drive back up that mountain, past those 3 dead oaks, into that nameless town. And I'll join the others, becoming another vessel for the hungry awareness that lives there. But here, that's what truly terrifies me, what keeps me awake at night in sweating panic. I'm not the only one. I started seeing the spiral symbol in other places, scratched into bathroom stalls, spray painted on overpasses, carved into park benches, always in Pennsylvania, always in small towns, always spreading slowly outward from that empty space on the map where Ashford Mills used to be. The consciousness is patient. It waited decades in isolation, but now it has found a way to spread. Through people like me, through anyone curious enough to find that forgotten town, anyone foolish enough to stay long enough for the seeds to take root. We become carriers, spreading the symbol, speaking of the place in whispers, drawing others toward it with our stories. I am writing this as a warning, but I know the truth. This isn't a warning. This is an invitation, because part of me, the part that is no longer entirely my own, wants others to know. Wants others to find that dirt road and those 3 dead oaks. Wants the consciousness to grow, to spread, to eventually consume everything until there are no more individuals, no more isolation, no more secrets or lies or loneliness. Just the terrible unity of shared consciousness, spreading through Pennsylvania like a creeping shadow, turning every small town into another nameless place where boundaries between minds dissolve and darkness flows freely between merged souls. The town erased its name to contain the horror, but some things can be contained forever. Some hungers are too patient, too persistent. And now that they found it, now that it has found me, the erasure is ending. The nameless place is waking up. And soon, it won't be nameless anymore. Soon, everyone will know its touch, feel its presence, join its eternal communion. I can feel it calling me back right now. Tomorrow, I think I'll answer. Story 9. Motel with no guests. The vacancy sign was flickering when it should have been off completely. I noticed it around 2 in the morning on Interstate 80, somewhere in the forgotten hills of Pennsylvania where cell service dies and GPS loses signal. The Red Pine Motor Lodge sat off the highway like something out of a different era. its neon sign casting an eerie red glow across empty parking spaces. What made my skin crawl wasn't the rundown appearance or the isolation. It was the lights. Every single room had its curtains drawn, and behind each window, I could see the unmistakable flicker of television screens. Someone was awake in every room at this ungodly hour, in a motel that looked like it had been abandoned for decades. I am a pharmaceutical sales representative. I drive these Pennsylvania back roads constantly, staying in cheap motels, eating at truck stops, living out of my suitcase. After 15 years, you develop instincts about places. You know which establishments are safe and which ones you should speed past without a second glance. Everything about the Red Pine screamed danger, but my options were limited. A storm had rolled in an hour ago, turning the highway into a nightmare of rain and zero visibility. I was exhausted, my eyes burning, my reflexes slowing. I needed rest before I became another roadside statistic. The parking lot was completely empty. Not a single car, yet those lights blazed in every window. And as I pulled closer, I could hear something that made my heart rate spike. Phones ringing. Multiple phones, all ringing in different rooms, creating a discordant chorus that cut through the sound of rain hammering my windshield. The noise was constant, relentless, like some horrifying soundtrack to a nightmare I hadn't realized I entered. The office sat at the far end of the long, single-story building. A neon office sign buzzed and sputtered above the door, and through the window, I could see someone behind the counter. An older man, maybe 60, his face illuminated by the blue glow of a television. He looked normal enough, wearing a plaid shirt and reading glasses, flipping through what appeared to be a newspaper. Just a regular night clerk at a rundown motel. But when I stepped inside, dripping rainwater onto the worn linoleum, he didn't look up, didn't acknowledge my presence at all. The television played static, that white noise hiss that fills the air with tension. The newspaper he was reading, I realized with growing unease, was yellowed and brittle, dated August 1987. 38 years old. I cleared my throat, asked if they had any rooms available. The man finally lifted his eyes to meet mine, and I saw something in them that made me want to run back to my car. They were empty, not vacant in the sense of being tired or distracted, but literally empty, like looking into dark holes that went nowhere. He smiled, revealing teeth that were too white, too perfect, too uniform. He told me they had plenty of rooms. In fact, every room was available. Always available, never booked. The motel with no guests always had space for one more. His hand, when he pushed the registration card across the counter, felt cold even though I didn't touch it. The card itself was ancient, the paper thick and rough, the kind they stopped making decades ago. I signed my name, my hand shaking slightly, trying to convince myself this was just exhaustion playing tricks on my perception. The clerk handed me a key attached to a diamond-shaped plastic fob with the number 13 embossed in faded gold. Room 13, of course. The rain had intensified, turning the short walk to my room into a sprint through a wall of water. But even through the downpour, I could still hear those phones ringing. Room after room, the sound never stopping, never answered. I passed window after window, each with drawn curtains and that telltale television glow. But something was wrong with the light. It flickered in perfect synchronization across all the rooms, as if every television was tuned to the same channel, showing the same program at the exact same moment. I reached room 13 and fumbled with the key, my fingers numb from cold and creeping fear. The door swung open with a creak that sounded like a scream, and I stepped into a space that smelled of mildew and something else. Something sweet and rotten, like flowers left too long in a vase. The room was exactly what you'd expect from a cheap roadside motel. A sagging bed with a floral bedspread, a wooden dresser with a mirror, a television on a stand, a bathroom visible through an open door, all perfectly normal except for one disturbing detail. The phone was ringing. It sat on the nightstand, an old rotary model in that particular shade of avocado green popular in the 70s. The sound was shrill and insistent, drilling into my skull. I stared at it, every instinct screaming not to answer, but the ringing continued without pause. One ring, two, three, on and on, never going to voicemail, never stopping. I picked up the receiver. Static flooded my ear, thick and heavy, punctuated by sounds that made my blood freeze. Breathing, multiple people breathing in rhythm, creating a chorus of inhalations and exhalations that sounded both human and horribly wrong. Then, cutting through the static, a voice. My voice, speaking words I hadn't said yet, describing this exact moment, this exact room, this exact terrifying realization that something was deeply, impossibly wrong with the Red Pine Motor Lodge. I slammed the phone down, my heart hammering against my ribs. The ringing stopped, but in the sudden silence, I heard something worse. Footsteps in the room above me. Heavy, deliberate footsteps pacing back and forth in a steady rhythm. Except this was a single-story motel. There was no room above me. There was only roof and the rain in the darkness beyond. The television turned on by itself. No warning, no gradual warming up of the screen. One moment it was off, the next it displayed an image that made me gasp. Security camera footage of the motel parking lot. My car sat alone in the frame, rain streaming across the lens. But in the corner of the screen, barely visible in the shadows, stood a figure. A person watching my vehicle, standing perfectly still despite the storm, wearing what looked like clothes from another era. The footage jumped, skipping ahead in time. Now the figure stood closer to my car. Another jump, closer still. The timestamps in the corner showed this was happening in real time. Right now, someone or something was approaching my vehicle while I watched helplessly from inside this nightmare room. I ran to the window and yanked the curtains open. The parking lot stretched empty and dark, my car sitting exactly where I left it. No figure, no person, nothing but rain and shadows and the eerie red glow of the vacancy sign. I looked back at the television. The footage showed the figure pressed against my driver, his side window now, peering inside with its face obscured by the reflection of the neon sign. The phone started ringing again. This time I didn't answer. I grabbed my keys and headed for the door, done with this place, willing to drive through the storm rather than spend another second in this creepy, unsettling, absolutely horrifying room. But when I turned the doorknob, it wouldn't move. Locked. I tried my key. Nothing. The mechanism wouldn't turn, as if the lock had been welded shut. I was trapped. The footsteps above me grew louder, more frantic, joined now by other sounds. Furniture being dragged, things falling, voices calling out in distress. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, knowing even as I did it that no help would come. The clerk in the office wouldn't respond. The other guests, if they even existed, wouldn't hear me. I was alone in room 13 of a motel that should have been condemned decades ago. The television cycled through channels now, each one showing different security footage. The parking lot from multiple angles. The hallway outside my room. The office where the clerk still sat reading his ancient newspaper. And other rooms. My God, the other rooms. Each one occupied by people who looked wrong, off, like poorly made copies of human beings. They sat on beds or stood at windows or lay motionless on the floor, all of them with those same empty eyes, all of them waiting for something. Waiting for me. The realization hit like a physical blow. This motel didn't have guests. It collected them. Everyone who checked in became part of whatever nightmare existed here, trapped forever in rooms that existed outside normal time and space. The lights were always on because the people inside never left. The phones rang constantly because they were trying to call for help. Their voices transmitted across years and dimensions, heard but never answered. I was going to become one of them. The bathroom door, which I had left open, swung slowly closed. Through the gap, I saw movement, a shadow that didn't correspond to any light source, sliding across the floor like oil, gathering itself into a form that suggested a person but wasn't quite right. Too many limbs, too many angles, a shape that hurt to look at directly. The phone stopped ringing. In the sudden silence, I heard a new sound. Scratching. Something scratching at the bathroom door from the inside, trying to get out, trying to reach me. The doorknob turned slowly, deliberately, and I backed away until I hit the window, my mind racing through options that didn't exist. Then the scratching stopped. The television went dark. The shadow retreated. For one brief, beautiful moment, I thought maybe it was over. Maybe I had imagined the whole thing. Exhaustion and stress creating hallucinations in an admittedly creepy but ultimately harmless motel. The lights in every room went out simultaneously. Darkness swallowed the Red Pine Motor Lodge completely. No neon signs, no television glow, no illumination from the office. Just absolute, suffocating blackness broken only by the faint flash of lightning through my window. And in those brief moments of light, I saw them. Figures standing outside every room, dozens of them, all facing my door. All waiting, The storm ended. Not gradually, but instantly, as if someone had flipped a switch. The rain stopped mid-fall. The wind died. The clouds parted to reveal a moon that cast everything in pale, sickly light. In that light, I finally saw the Red Pine Motor Lodge for what it truly was. The building was falling apart, windows broken, walls crumbling, the roof sagging dangerously. This place had been abandoned for years, maybe decades. The nice room I thought I was standing in didn't exist. I was in a gutted shell, walls covered in mold and decay, the floor littered with debris. The bed was a rusted frame with no mattress. The television was a shattered screen on a broken stand, and the door hung open. Had always been open. I could leave anytime I wanted. I ran, sprinted across the parking lot to my car, my feet splashing through puddles that reflected moonlight in disturbing patterns. Behind me, I heard footsteps, many footsteps, all those figures from the rooms, following, keeping pace, never quite catching up but never falling behind either. I reached my car, fumbled with the keys, threw myself into the driver's seat. The engine started on the first try, and I floored it, tires screaming as I shot back onto the highway. In my rearview mirror, the Red Pine Motor Lodge receded into darkness, and standing in the parking lot, I saw the clerk. Just standing there, watching me go with those empty eyes and that too perfect smile. I drove until sunrise, not stopping until I reached a rest stop 50 miles away. When I finally calmed down enough to think clearly, I searched online for the Red Pine Motor Lodge. I found it easily. There were dozens of reviews, all saying the same thing. Nice rooms, friendly staff, great rates, 5 stars. Recent reviews from just days ago, describing stays at a motel I knew, with absolute certainty, hadn't been operational in decades. The motel with no guests was still collecting people, still trapping them in rooms that existed somewhere between the world of the living and whatever comes after. And somehow, impossibly, I had escaped. But sometimes, late at night, when I'm alone in another anonymous motel room, the phone rings. I never answer, because I know what I'll hear. My own voice, calling from the Red Pine Motor Lodge, describing how I'm trapped, how I can't leave, how the lights are always on and the phones never stop ringing. Maybe I never left at all. Story 10. Last call from the hills. The 911 recording should not exist. I know because I listened to it myself, sitting in a dispatch center in rural Pennsylvania at 3 a.m, and what I heard that night changed everything I thought I understood about reality. The call came through on October 14, 2019, from a house that had been empty for 7 years. No power, no phone lines, nothing but rotting wood and broken windows in the middle of nowhere. Yet someone called for help, and that recording is still archived in our system, still playable, still absolutely terrifying. I am a 911 dispatcher, have been for 12 years in Chester County, handling everything from medical emergencies to domestic disputes to the occasional prank call. You develop a thick skin in this job. You learn to stay calm when people are screaming, to think clearly when chaos erupts on the other end of the line. But nothing prepared me for that call. Nothing could have. It started like static, that low hiss you get from a bad connection. Then breathing, ragged, desperate breathing like someone had been running for their life. I went through my standard protocol, asking for location and the nature of the emergency. The breathing stopped. For maybe 10 seconds, there was absolute silence, the kind that makes your skin crawl, that feels heavy and raw. Then a voice came through, so distorted and distant it barely sounded human. The words were simple but chilling. They needed help. They were trapped. Something was in the house with them. Something that shouldn't be there. Something that had been waiting a very long time. I pulled up the location from the caller ID. The address made my blood run cold. 1847 Hickory Ridge Road. I knew that house. Everyone in the county knew that house. The Morrison place. 7 years ago, the entire family disappeared. Parents, 2 teenage kids, even the dog. Gone without a trace. Police searched for months. Found nothing. No bodies. No evidence of foul play. No indication of where they went or why. The house had sat abandoned ever since, gradually falling apart, becoming another creepy local legend that people told stories about but avoided after dark. Nobody lived there. Nobody could be calling from there. But the system showed an active call from that exact address, and protocol demanded I send someone to investigate. I dispatched Sheriff Deputy Marcus Chen, a good cop who had been on the force for 15 years. I told him it was probably a prank, Kids with some kind of device that could spoof phone numbers. But my voice must have betrayed something. Some hint of the unsettling fear crawling up my spine, because he asked if I was okay. I told him to be careful. The call remained open, that eerie silence continuing, broken only by occasional sounds that made my heart race. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps on old wooden floors. Creaking that suggested weight moving through the structure. And underneath it all, a sound I couldn't quite identify. A low humming, almost mechanical, but with an organic quality that made it deeply disturbing. Marcus radioed in 20 minutes later. He had arrived at the Morrison house. His voice sounded tense, uncertain. The place was dark, exactly as abandoned as it should be. No cars, no lights, no signs of forced entry, but his spotlight had caught something strange on the front porch. Fresh mud, boot prints leading to the door and disappearing inside, as if someone had walked in but never walked out. He was going to check it out. I wanted to tell him not to. Every instinct screamed that this was dangerous, that something was terribly wrong. But dispatch doesn't work that way. You send officers to investigate. You trust their training. You stay professional even when nightmare scenarios play out in your head. The call from the house suddenly erupted with sound. Not the distorted voice from before, but something worse. Screaming. Raw, primal screaming filled with such terror and agony that I ripped my headset off, my hands shaking. When I forced myself to put it back on, the screaming had stopped. Now there was only that disturbing humming sound, louder than before, pulsing in a rhythm that felt almost like a heartbeat. Marcus radioed again. His voice had changed. He sounded scared, trying to hide it but failing. He was inside the house now. The front door had been unlocked, swinging open when he touched it. The boot prints continued through the entrance hall, tracked through dust that looked undisturbed for years. But here was the horrifying part. The prints were fresh, wet mud, yet there had been no rain in the area for over a week. He followed them deeper into the house, his flashlight cutting through darkness so complete it seemed to swallow the beam. The furniture remained exactly as the Morrison family had left it. A coffee mug on the kitchen table, still half full of something that had long since evaporated to brown residue. Jackets hanging on hooks by the door. A television remote sitting on the couch arm. Everything frozen in time, waiting for people who would never return. The boot prints led upstairs. Marcus described what he saw as he climbed, and I transcribed every word into the incident report, my fingers cold despite the warm dispatch center. The stairs groaned under his weight, and with each step, he heard something above him. Movement, something heavy being dragged across the floor. He called out, identifying himself as police, demanding whoever was up there show themselves. The dragging sound stopped. The silence that followed was worse than any noise. Marcus reached the top of the stairs and found himself in a hallway with 4 doors, all closed except one at the far end. That door stood slightly ajar, and from the gap, a faint light flickered. Not electric light, something else. Something that cast dancing shadows on the hallway walls, shadows that moved in ways that didn't match any visible source. He approached the door, his service weapon drawn, every nerve on high alert. Later, he would tell me that he felt watched, not just by one presence, but by many. The air felt thick, hard to breathe, and smelled of something rotten and ancient. The temperature had dropped dramatically. His breath came out in clouds, and frost formed on the wallpaper in intricate patterns that looked disturbingly like faces screaming in agony. He pushed the door open. The room beyond should have been a bedroom. Instead, Marcus found something impossible. The walls were covered in writing, floor to ceiling, every inch filled with the same words repeated thousands of times in different handwritings. They re still here. They re still here. They re still here. Some written in pencil, some in pen, some that looked like they had been scratched into the plaster with fingernails. In the center of the room stood an old rotary phone, olive green, covered in dust, the cord trailing to a wall jack that had been ripped out years ago. No connection to any line. No possible way it could work. It was ringing. Marcus stared at it, his training warring with the primal part of his brain that screamed for him to run. The phone continued its shrill, old-fashioned ring, each peal echoing in the empty house. Against every instinct, following some compulsion he couldn't explain, he reached out and picked up the receiver. I heard everything through his open radio. The static, the breathing, then voices. Multiple voices, all talking at once, overlapping in a horrifying chorus. Marcus recognized them instantly. The Morrison family. He had taken their missing persons report 7 years ago, had interviewed neighbors and friends, had spent months searching. Now their voices poured through that impossible phone, begging for help that came far too late. They described what happened, how they heard scratching in the walls one night, how it grew louder over weeks until it sounded like dozens of things moving behind the plaster, how they tried to leave but found themselves unable to cross the threshold, some invisible barrier holding them inside their own home, how the shadows began moving independently, reaching out with dark tendrils that felt solid and cold, how one by one they were pulled into the walls, into the spaces between, into a darkness that existed alongside our world but separate from it. They were still there, still trapped, still conscious and aware and suffering in that horrible in-between place. And they weren't alone. The voices changed, becoming deeper, more numerous, speaking in languages Marcus didn't recognize. He described hearing hundreds of voices, maybe thousands, all crying out from whatever nightmare dimension had claimed the Morrison family. The walls began to pulse, breathing like living things, and the writing covering them started to move, letters rearranging themselves into new messages. Join us. Stay with us. You can. Leave. None of us can leave. Marcus dropped the phone and ran. He barely made it out of the room before the door slammed shut behind him with enough force to crack the frame. The house came alive around him, every door opening and closing in sequence. Lights that shouldn't to work flickering on and off. That disturbing humming sound rising to a deafening roar. He took the stairs 3 at a time, burst through the front door, and didn't stop running until he reached his patrol car. The 911 call ended exactly when Marcus left the property. One moment, active connection with all those terrible sounds. The next, dead silence. The call log showed it had lasted 47 minutes. The recording captured everything. Marcus quit the force 3 days later, moved to Florida, as far from Pennsylvania as he could get while staying on the East Coast. Before he left, he told me something that still haunts me. When he was in that upstairs room, when he picked up that impossible phone, he heard one more thing. A voice he recognized, his own voice, calling for help, begging someone to come to 1847 Hickory Ridge Road, describing how he was trapped, how something was in the house with him, how he couldn't leave. A recording of a call he hadn't made yet. A premonition of what would happen if he stayed. The house still stands. The county tried to demolish it twice. Both times, the construction crews reported equipment malfunctions, disturbing sounds coming from inside, and workers who swore they saw faces in the windows. Both times, they abandoned the job. Now the place just sits there, rotting slowly, waiting. But here is what keeps me awake at night. Every few months, we get another 911 call from that address. Always at night. Always the same distorted voice begging for help. Always describing something terrible in the house. The calls are getting more frequent, more desperate. And each time, the system shows an active connection from a building with no power, no phone service, no explanation for how anyone could be calling. I listened to the archived recordings. All of them. Each one is slightly different. But they all share one chilling detail. In the background, beneath the static and the breathing and the terrifying sounds, you can hear something else. A countdown, numbers being whispered in that same distorted voice, descending slowly. The last call I received came through 2 weeks ago. The countdown reached 0. I don't know what that means. I don't want to know. But every night when I sit down at my dispatch console, I watch that address on my screen. 1847 Hickory Ridge Road, waiting for the phone to ring again. Waiting to hear what comes after 0. Waiting to discover what happens when whatever horror lives in that house finally finishes its patient, terrible work. Because I know, with absolute certainty, that the calls will continue. The house wants something. The things trapped inside want something. And sooner or later, someone will answer their plea. Someone will go there and not come back. Someone will become another voice added to that nightmare chorus. I pray it's not me. But sometimes, late at night when the board is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I hear it. That low humming sound, that rhythmic pulse, coming from somewhere that ISN, didn't quite hear, but ISN, didn't quite gone either. Getting closer, getting louder, getting ready. The last call from the hills is still archived. Anyone with clearance can listen to it. But nobody does, nobody except me. Because once you hear it, once you really listen to what those voices are saying, you understand the terrifying truth. The Morrison family ISN, asking to be saved anymore. They re-warning us. Stay away. Don, answer, Don, to come looking. Because the house is hungry. And it is patient. And eventually, it gets everyone who gets too close.